Last Thursday, right as the sky was breaking into that molten orange glow over the Mississippi, I found myself sitting at a wobbly metal table outside a little corner joint called Marcy's. It ain't famous or nothing, just a place where the coffee's cheap and the staff's got enough sass to keep you humble. I'd been sitting there for a while, picking at a plate of red beans and rice, trying to think up a new melody for the street set later. My harmonica sat beside me, its brass gleaming in the sunset, when I caught sight of this woman across the street. She was standing in front of an old payphone, one of the few still clinging to life in this city. Looked like she was trying to figure it out, which was odd enough. When's the last time you saw someone even look at a payphone? She wasn't a tourist, not dressed in that I'm trying to blend in, but I'm from Ohio way. No, she looked local. Worn jeans, scuffed sneakers, hair tied up like she'd been running errands all day. But there she was, staring at that phone like it held the answers to something heavy. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my harp, shoved it in my pocket, and crossed the street. "You lost?" I asked, leaning against the pole. "Or just nostalgic?" She looked up, startled, then laughed, a short, quiet kind of laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Neither, I guess," she said. "Just wondering if it still works." I tilted my head. "Haven't seen anyone use one of these since the Saints won the Super Bowl. What's got you thinking about it?" She hesitated, fiddling with the strap of her bag. "My dad used to call me from a payphone just like this. Back when he was around." She reached out and touched the receiver like it was something sacred. He'd always say the same thing. "Kiddo, you still there?" Like he thought one day I'd stop picking up. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say nothing. Sometimes it's better to let the silence do the talking. She shook her head, as if to clear the memory, and laughed again, softer this time. "Sorry. That probably sounds weird, huh? Everyone's got cell phones now, and I'm over here getting misty-eyed about a broken payphone." "Nah," I said. "Not weird at all. Some things just stick to you like gum on the bottom of your shoe. Might not seem important to anybody else, but to you, it's the whole world." She smiled at that, a real one this time, and I noticed she had this tiny gap between her front teeth, like she'd never bothered to fix it because it suited her just fine. "You're a musician, huh?" she asked, nodding toward the harmonica sticking out of my pocket. "Something like that," I said. "Want to hear a tune?" Her eyes lit up, and she stepped back like she was settling in for a show. I pulled out the harp and started playing a slow, bluesy riff, something that felt like it belonged to the crackle of a long-distance call. As I played, she closed her eyes, leaning against the pole, letting the music wash over her. When I finished, she opened her eyes and whispered. That's what it sounded like. "What's that?" I asked, tucking the harmonica back into my pocket. "The way my dad used to talk," she said, all warm and crackly, like a record playing through an old speaker. That's what it felt like when he called. For a moment, the city around us faded. The cars, the chatter, the faint hum of a streetcar rolling by. All of it dimmed like the volume knob had been turned down. It was just her and me and that busted-up payphone. "You ever try calling it?" I asked, just to see what happens. She looked at me like I'd suggested something impossible. "What, like calling him? He's been gone for years." "Doesn't mean he's not listening," I said, shrugged in. "Couldn't hurt, right?" She stared at the phone for a long time before finally digging some change out of her pocket. I stepped back, giving her space, and watched as she slid the coins into the slot and picked up the receiver. Her hand trembled just a little, but she held it steady as she dialed. For a moment, she just stood there, her eyes closed, the receiver pressed to her ear. I don't know what she heard. Maybe nothing, maybe something. But when she hung up, she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Thanks. I don't know why, but thanks." "Anytime," I said, meaning it. She walked away then, disappearing into the golden light of the evening, leaving me alone with the payphone and the hum of the city coming back to life around me. I stood there for a while, wondering what she'd heard on the other end. Static, maybe, or the faint echo of her own voice. It got me thinking about how some things, people, places, even busted payphones, stick around longer than we expect. Not in the way we want, maybe, but in the way we need. They hold memories like songs, waiting for the right person to pick them up and listen. You ever feel that? Like the universe leaves something behind just for you to find? Maybe it's a photograph, a voicemail, or even a broken phone on a corner street. Whatever it is, I hope you answer it when it calls. Let's start a new story. I'm not proud of this, but for the longest time, I avoided eye contact with buskers. You know, the street musicians and performers who set up shop in subway stations or on busy corners. It wasn't about the music. In fact, some of them were amazing. But there was something about that raw vulnerability, the way they put themselves out there for the world to see and judge, that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was because I knew I could never do it, not in a million years. So, like a true coward, I'd shuffle past, pretending to scroll my phone or suddenly becoming fascinated by my shoelaces. That changed one gray November evening when I was late for a train. I was power walking through the station, coat flapping behind me like a very unimpressive superhero, when I heard it. A violin, sharp and aching, cutting through the usual symphony of muffled announcements and hurried footsteps. It was the kind of sound that makes you stop, not because you want to, but because it grabs something deep in your chest and won't let go. I almost kept walking. I was late after all. But then I saw him, an older man, probably in his 70s, playing with a quiet intensity that made the chaos around him feel irrelevant. His violin case was open at his feet, a smattering of coins and a few crumpled bills inside. But he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were closed, face tilted slightly upward, like he was playing for someone. Or something. Only he could see. And here's where it gets weird. I swear, as I stood there, it was like the world shifted. Not in some dramatic Hollywood special effects kind of way, but subtly, like when you realize you've been reading a word wrong your whole life. I suddenly noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way people flowed around him, some slowing down for a moment before moving on, others hurrying past like he didn't exist. The way the light from the overhead fluorescence reflected off his violin, making it look almost golden. And the song, oh man, the song. I didn't know what it was, but it felt like a conversation, like he was telling a story without words. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point, the song ended. He opened his eyes, glanced around, and nodded politely at a few claps from the scattered audience. I wanted to say something, anything, but what do you say to someone who just cracked open your soul with a piece of wood and some strings? So, like the awkward human I am, I dropped a $10 bill into his case and mumbled, "That was beautiful," before scurrying away. I made my train, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Over the next few weeks, I found myself lingering whenever I passed a busker, actually listening instead of rushing past. Some were great, others not so much, but they all had that same quiet bravery, the willingness to create something and share it, no matter how the world might respond. It was humbling, honestly. Here I was terrified of even speaking up in a meeting, while these people stood in public spaces, pouring themselves into their art with no guarantee of recognition or reward. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many moments I'd missed because I was too busy or too scared to stop and engage. Not just with buskers, but with people in general. How many smiles had I ignored? How many conversations had I cut short? All because I didn't want to feel vulnerable. It hit me like a freight train. I was living my life at a safe distance, keeping the world at arm's length because it felt easier that way. But in doing so, I was also keeping out the beauty, the connection, the humanity of it all. You started small? The next time I passed a busker, I didn't just listen. I clapped when they finished. I complimented a woman on her painting in the park. I asked the cashier how their day was going, and actually meant it. Each interaction felt like cracking open a window in a stuffy room, letting in just a little more air, a little more light. A few months later, I saw the violinist again. Same station, same spot, but this time I wasn't rushing. I stood and listened for the whole set, and when he finished, I worked up the nerve to approach him. I told him how much his music had meant to me that day, how it had been the start of something I didn't even know I needed. He smiled this small, knowing smile, and said, "Music has a way of finding people when they need it most." Then he shook my hand and said his name was Arthur. I don't know what I expected, a profound conversation, maybe, or some nugget of wisdom that would change my life forever. But that was it. Arthur packed up his violin and walked away, leaving me standing there with a strange mix of gratitude and longing. Gratitude for the lesson, longing for the courage to create something of my own, to put it out into the world without fear. I still think about Arthur sometimes, especially when I'm tempted to retreat back into my bubble. His music taught me that connection, real, messy, human connection, is worth the risk. And now, I try to carry that with me, whether it's in a conversation with a stranger or simply stopping to enjoy a moment of beauty in the chaos of life. So, that's my story. Have you ever had a moment like that? Something small, almost forgettable, that ended up shifting the way you see the world? I'd love to hear about it if you're up for sharing. Let's start a new story. There's something delightful about the way people take selfies these days, isn't there? I never thought I'd use delightful to describe an act so inherently modern. Yet here I am. It hit me the other day while I was sitting on a park bench, idly people watching as the world streamed by. This girl walked by with her little dog, one of those scrappy little terriers that thinks it's a Doberman. She stopped near a bed of bright yellow flowers, crouched down, and held her phone at arm's length. The dog, apparently a seasoned veteran in the art of posing, perked up its ears, tilted its head just so, and the two of them beamed at the screen. She clicked the button, gave the dog a scratch behind the ears, and they walked off, leaving me grinning like an idiot. I don't know what got to me more, the dog clearly knowing it was the star of the show, or how unself-conscious she was about the whole thing. I remember a time when taking a photo of yourself in public would have been the height of embarrassment. You'd mumble something about checking your camera and hope no one noticed. But now, it's this universal act of joy. People take selfies everywhere, on hikes, at concerts, at coffee shops, or in one particularly brave example I witnessed while standing in line at the DMV. It's like we've collectively agreed to document every moment that feels a little brighter than the rest. What I love most is how these snapshots are rarely perfect. The hair's a bit messy, the angle's just slightly off, or someone's making a face in the background. That's the charm, though. It's like saying, here I am, just as I am, living this little moment of happiness. And sure, I know not all selfies are genuine. Some are choreographed and filtered into oblivion, but even that feels like a weirdly human thing to do. We've always tried to present the best versions of ourselves. This is just the modern equivalent of tidying up before company comes over. But it's not just selfies that get me. It's the comments people leave when someone shares one. I saw a post the other day from a guy who'd finally worked up the courage to wear nail polish, just a simple black coat on his fingertips. He looked a little shy in the picture, but the comments? They were like a flood of sunshine. Strangers hyping him up, telling him he looked awesome, that he rocked the vibe. I think about how isolating it must have been just a few decades ago for people to try something bold or different, only to feel like no one was in their corner. Now, there's an audience of cheerleaders waiting to say, yes, you're killing it. There's also this trend I've noticed where people are quick to share hacks and tips with complete strangers. Need to know how to remove a stain from your favorite shirt? Someone's got a trick involving baking soda and sheer wizardry. Trying to figure out the best way to boil an egg? You'll have 10 different methods to choose from, complete with debates about which one is superior. It's like we've collectively decided that life's small annoyances are a team sport, and we're all in it together. I recently watched a video of a guy teaching people how to fold fitted sheets. Not only was it hilarious, he kept pretending the sheet was trying to fight him, but the comments were filled with people saying things like, I've been doing laundry wrong for 40 years, and this man deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. And don't even get me started on how much I love watching people figure out skateboarding tricks or nail a dance routine after hours of practice. There's something so pure about seeing someone post their fail reel alongside the final, triumphant moment. Like, look at how many times I fell, but also look at how I got back up every single time. I think that kind of openness, that willingness to share the messy bits, is quietly revolutionary. It reminds us that nobody's an overnight success. We're all just stumbling forward together. Even when I'm scrolling through the absurd stuff, like the guy who taped his phone to his ceiling to get the perfect selfie angle, I can't help but laugh and appreciate the sheer creativity. I mean, that's commitment. And the comments are always half the fun. Someone will post, "Why didn't you just buy a tripod?" And another person will reply with something completely unhinged like, "Tripods are for cowards." It's this blend of humor, ingenuity, and shared absurdity that makes it all feel like we're part of the same big, sprawling, ridiculous conversation. So now, When I see someone pausing in the middle of a busy street to get a photo with a particularly well-lit building or propping their phone up on a water bottle to capture their latest dance move, I don't roll my eyes like I might have 10 years ago. Instead, I feel this quiet sense of connection. Like here we are all trying to find these tiny, lovely moments in the chaos of it all. It's a little bit silly, a little bit beautiful, and completely human. I guess I'm just curious. What's a modern habit or trend that makes you smile when you notice it? Something small, maybe even silly, but undeniably delightful? Let's start a new story. This morning, I woke up underwater. Not in a gasping for air, I'm drowning kind of way, but in an oddly peaceful, floaty kind of way. My bed was still there, soft as ever, but it was suspended in what looked like a giant bubble of air, surrounded by endless, glittering blue. Schools of fish darted around, their scales catching the sunlight filtering down from somewhere far above. Kelp swayed lazily like it had all the time in the world, and a crab waved at me from the bedpost. Like this was a totally normal Tuesday. I sat up slowly, half expecting to wake up for real, but nope. Still underwater. My hair floated around my head like some kind of cheap shampoo commercial, and Moose, my dog, was snoring beside me, oblivious to the fact that he was in a bubble bed at the bottom of what appeared to be the ocean. Right, I said to no one in particular. Guess we're doing this. As if on cue, a jellyfish floated into view, its long, trailing tentacles glowing faintly. It didn't sting me. Instead, it bobbed in place and spoke in a calm, melodic voice. "Good morning, land dweller. You're late." "Late for what?" I asked, swinging my legs off the bed and landing on nothing. The bubble held me up, solid as ground, even though it was perfectly see-through. "Exploration," the jellyfish replied. "The coral is waiting." "The coral?" Yes, it said, clearly impatient. "You're here for the tour, aren't you? Or did they not brief you before you arrived?" "Definitely not briefed," I said. The jellyfish made a huffing noise, which I didn't even know was possible for jellyfish, and started drifting away. "Come along, then. We'll sort it out as we go." Moose finally woke up, yawning in a way that made his bubble ripple slightly. When he saw where we were, his tail thumped once. Then he gave me a look that clearly said, "This is your fault." "Don't blame me," I muttered. The jellyfish led us through the underwater world, like a tour guide who'd been doing this forever. As we walked, or in Moose's case, trotted along the bubble path, I noticed that everything seemed alive. Not just in the obvious way, but in a talking way. The coral hummed softly as we passed, each piece singing a different note, like a choir warming up. The fish weren't just darting around randomly. They were weaving patterns in the water, as if painting with their movements. At one point, a particularly large sea turtle swam up beside us, its voice deep and slow. "Haven't seen a land dweller down here in ages. What's your business?" Just following the jellyfish," I said, gesturing toward my glowing guide, who was muttering something about keeping to the schedule. The turtle chuckled, the sound reverberating through the water like distant thunder. "Well, enjoy it. Not everyone gets to see the reef mind." "The what now?" I asked, but the turtle had already swum off, its massive flippers carving slow arcs through the water. As we continued, the ocean grew brighter and more vibrant. The coral towers around us pulsed with colors that shifted and flowed like breathing rainbows, and the water itself seemed to hum with energy. Moose, who'd been sniffing at random fish, suddenly froze, his ears perked up. "What is it, boy?" I asked, half expecting him to bark, even though we were underwater. Before he could react, the path opened up into a massive clearing, where the coral spiraled upward into a vast, glowing structure. It was alive, every inch of it pulsing with light and movement, like a beating heart made of the ocean itself. "Behold," said the jellyfish, its voice reverent for the first time, "the reef mind." As I stepped closer, the humming intensified, becoming a chorus of voices, not in my ears, but in my head. They weren't speaking words exactly, but I could understand them anyway. Memories, questions, feelings, all swirling together like currents in the water. "You are seen," the voices said, overlapping and intertwining. "You are part of the whole." Okay, I said, my voice shaky. This is a lot. The reef mind pulsed brighter, and I felt a sudden wave of warmth, not physical, but emotional, like being wrapped in a hug after a long, hard day. The voices quieted, and a single one rose above the rest, calm and steady. Why do you wander? It asked. The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I'm always looking for something. Peace, maybe? Purpose? The reef mind didn't respond right away. Instead, it sent an image into my mind, me sitting on a mountaintop, staring out at the horizon. It was a memory, but it felt clearer somehow, like the reef mind had taken it and polished it, showing me something I hadn't noticed before. You seek connection, it said finally. You already have it. I glanced at Moose, who was wagging his tail at a passing school of glowing fish. The reef mind pulsed again, softer this time, and the voices faded into a gentle hum. The jellyfish floated up beside me, its glow dimmer now. That's it then. You've been seen. You can go. Go where? I asked, but the jellyfish didn't answer. Instead, the bubble beneath my feet began to rise, lifting me and Moose up and away from the glowing coral. As we ascended, the light faded, and the ocean around us grew darker. I clutched Moose tightly, half expecting the bubble to pop, but it held firm. Before I knew it, we were back in my bedroom, the sunlight streaming through the windows as if nothing had happened. Moose hopped off the bed, shook himself, and trotted to his food bowl like it was just another day. My phone blinked on the nightstand, a single notification lighting up the screen. You were seen. I don't know what any of it meant exactly, but I do know this. The world feels different now. Quieter, maybe, but also louder in a way I can't explain. Like everything, every tree, every river, every patch of sky has been trying to tell me something all along. So, what about you? If the world asked you why you wander, what do you think you'd say? And what do you think it would show you in return? Let's start a new story. A faint scent of anticipation swirling with the music. I was leaning against the counter at the Cafe Turn Bar, a place with dim lights and overpriced cocktails. I hadn't planned to come out, but my friend Lisa had insisted, saying I needed to expand my horizons. So, there I was nursing a drink and scrolling on my phone to look busy when it happened. A man slid into the space next to me, his presence loud despite his quiet approach. He didn't speak immediately, which was somehow worse than if he'd tried one of those tired pickup lines. I glanced up cautiously and caught his eye, a mistake. He grinned like he'd just been handed an invitation. Hey, he said, leaning in slightly. Do you come here often? It was such a cliche that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I gave him the polite but firm smile I'd perfected over years of unnecessary small talk. Not really, I replied, hoping my disinterest would be evident. It wasn't. I figured, he continued unfazed. You don't seem like the regular crowd here. You got this classy vibe. Classy vibe. What did that even mean? I wanted to roll my eyes, but I kept my composure. Thanks, I said, non-committally, turning back to my drink in what I thought was a clear signal. But he didn't pick up on it. So, what's your name? He asked, still undeterred. This was the moment. The crossroads where I could either give a fake name and hope he got bored or shut this down entirely. Against my better judgment, I told him, It's Anna. Nice to meet you, Anna. I'm Mark. He extended his hand, and I shook it out of reflex. His grip lingered a second too long, and I pulled away, reaching for my phone as a subtle barrier. Mark launched into a story about how he discovered this place. Something about a friend of a friend and a wild night that ended in tequila shots and karaoke. I nodded at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, wondering how to extract myself without escalating the situation. It wasn't that Mark was overtly creepy. It was the undercurrent of entitlement in his demeanor. The way he assumed his presence was a gift I should be grateful for. Eventually, he paused, perhaps expecting me to reciprocate with a story of my own. Instead, I seized the opening. It's been nice chatting, but I'm actually here with friends, and I should get back to them. His expression faltered for a split second, but then he recovered, flashing that overconfident grin again. Sure thing. But hey, maybe I could get your number? We could grab coffee sometime. There was The dreaded moment of refusal. "I don't think so," I said, keeping my tone light but firm. "Thanks, though." Mark's grin froze, and I braced for the reaction. Would he argue? Try to guilt-trip me? Or worse, lash out? To his credit, or perhaps as a testament to his ego, he chuckled, shaking his head. "Your loss," he said, sliding off the stool. "Have a good night." As he walked away, I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders releasing. It wasn't the worst encounter I'd had, but it left me wondering why these situations always felt so fraught. Why the burden of managing someone else's feelings fell to me simply because I existed in a public space. I drained the rest of my drink and texted Lisa. "Time to call it a night," I wrote. "Let's get out of here." She found me a few minutes later, her face glowing from the dance floor's neon lights. "What happened?" she asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing major," I replied. "Just Mark." Lisa rolled her eyes knowingly. "Mark is everywhere," she said, linking her arm with mine as we headed for the door. "Next time, we're picking a different bar." We stepped into the cool night air, leaving Mark and his misplaced confidence behind. I thought about how simple it could be if only more people understood that being approachable didn't mean being available, or that sometimes a polite no was all the answer they'd ever need. Let's start a new story. Let me tell you about the time I accidentally became a wedding planner. Not on purpose. Obviously, I don't have the patience or the Pinterest boards for that. But when life decides to drop chaos in your lap, sometimes you just have to roll with it. Or in my case, sprint with it in a dress 2 sizes too small and a pair of shoes that were actively trying to kill me. It started on a Saturday morning, one of those golden Oregon mornings where the sunlight actually makes you believe everything might be okay. I was working the counter at the dog-eared page, halfway through organizing a new shipment of mystery novels, when the bell over the door jingled. In walked Emily. Sweet, nervous, always on the verge of a spiral Emily. She's one of my regulars, early 20s aspiring poet, usually clutching a latte and a stack of Sylvia Plath. But this time, she wasn't carrying books. She was carrying a wedding dress. "Claire," she said, breathless, her eyes wide with the kind of panic you usually only see in disaster movies. "I need help. You blinked to here." Okay. Are you running from the law? Or, "I'm supposed to get married in 3 hours," she interrupted, holding up the dress like it was evidence in a trial. "And everything is falling apart." Here's what I learned in the next 5 minutes. The florist had canceled last minute. The caterer's van had broken down somewhere outside of Salem. And her maid of honor, who was supposed to handle everything, was MIA because of an emergency involving a ferret, which Emily refused to elaborate on. The wedding was happening at a little park near the edge of town, and unless a miracle occurred, it was about to turn into a very expensive picnic. I should have said no. I should have told her to call someone else. Anyone else, and gone back to alphabetizing Agatha Christie. But then she looked at me, holding that dress like it was the last piece of her sanity, and before I knew it, I was saying, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" Fast forward an hour, and I'm standing in the middle of the park, surrounded by chaos. A handful of early guests were milling around, looking confused. The decorations consisted of half-inflated balloons and a single congrats banner that looked like it had survived a hurricane. Emily's fiancé, Jason, was pacing near the gazebo, muttering to himself about how this was a sign. And Emily? She was sitting on a bench in her sweats, clutching a thermos of tea and looking like she might cry. This apparently was my moment to shine. Step 1. Flowers. I grabbed my phone, called up Marla, my unofficial grandma figure and a retired florist, and begged her to raid her garden. 15 minutes later, she pulled up in her old Subaru with an entire back seat full of roses, daisies, and some other plants I couldn't name if my life depended on it. We slapped them together into bouquets that were, let's call them, rustic. Step 2. Food. I remembered there was a family-run deli a few blocks away, so I sprinted over there, still in my slightly too fancy for a park dress, and managed to sweet-talk the owner into throwing together a last-minute spread of sandwiches, fruit, and cookies. Shout out to the promise of a 5-star Yelp review. Step 3. Vibes. I don't know much about wedding aesthetics, but I do know how to set a mood. I found a Bluetooth speaker in Jason's car, paired it to my phone, and pulled up a playlist titled Sappy Love Songs for People Who Still Believe in Soulmates. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than silence, or worse, Jason's panic muttering. By the time I got back to the gazebo, Emily was in her dress, looking less like a disaster victim and more like an actual bride. The guests had started to arrive, and someone had even brought a bottle of champagne. It wasn't the picture-perfect wedding she'd probably dreamed of, but it was nice, cozy, like one of those indie movie weddings where everything's a little messy but full of heart. The ceremony itself was short and sweet. Emily and Jason exchanged vows under the slightly wonky congrats banner, with Marla's flowers in the background and the smell of deli sandwiches wafting through the air. When it was over, everyone cheered, and Emily hugged me so hard I thought she might crack a rib. "Thank you," she whispered. "Seriously, you saved the day." I said, brushing rose petals off my dress. "Just don't ask me to babysit your ferret-loving maid of honor." Here's the thing, I've always thought of myself as the kind of person who thrives on routine. I like my coffee hot, my books alphabetized, and my life as predictable as possible. But that day taught me something important. Sometimes you have to embrace the chaos. Because as much as I love a good plan, there's something magical about stepping into the unknown, even if it's messy and overwhelming and involves way too many sandwiches. So, what about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had no idea what you were doing, but somehow it all worked out? Or maybe you've had your own surprise wedding planner moment? Tell me everything. I'll bring the sandwiches. Let's start a new story. It started with a single bead of water racing down the window of the cafe where I sat nursing a cappuccino. Outside, the city stretched and yawned awake in its usual way. Cars nosing through intersections, the low hum of a bus engine, pedestrians weaving around one another like fish in a stream. But it was that bead of water that caught my attention, tracing its path down the glass, carving temporary rivers through the mist of condensation. A small thing, utterly unimportant, yet I couldn't look away. A woman sat down at the table across from me, shrugging off a rain-spattered coat. She set a book beside her coffee cup and opened it not to the first page, but somewhere deep in the middle, as though she couldn't wait to be back where she'd left off. I didn't mean to stare, but the rhythm of her page-turning was hypnotic, a private pulse beating in time with the day's growing buzz. I wondered if she noticed the rain or the faint scent of cinnamon in the air, or if she was as lost to her story as I was to the city unfolding outside. At the bus stop, 3 teenagers huddled under a single umbrella, their laughter rising above the hiss of tires on wet pavement. One of them had earbuds dangling around his neck, music leaking faintly into the damp air, a tinny drumbeat that sounded like a heartbeat if you strained to hear it. None of them noticed when the bus arrived, but the doors sighed open and waited anyway, patient as a parent calling kids home for dinner. The trio scrambled on at the last moment, their laughter spilling into the bus as the doors closed behind them. I sipped my coffee and let my eyes wander to the people walking past the cafe window. A man in a charcoal suit strode by, umbrella in hand, talking to no one. Or rather, to someone I couldn't see, a voice in his ear, a thread of connection to a world he carried in his pocket. A woman with a stroller paused to adjust the rain cover over her baby, and as she did, the little one inside kicked and squirmed, delighted by the sound of water pattering against the plastic shield. For a second, I thought the woman might laugh along, but instead, she checked her watch and hurried on. The cafe door opened with a burst of wind, and a barista hustled out carrying a tray of cups to a table on the patio. I hadn't even noticed anyone sitting out there. Who would in this weather? But sure enough, there was an older man, his coat buttoned up to his chin, steam rising from the tea in front of him. He nodded his thanks to the barista, then leaned forward to write something in a notebook, his pen scratching faintly against the page. What kind of man sits in the rain to write? I wondered, what story could be so urgent that it couldn't wait for the sun? The rain softened into a drizzle, and the city seemed to relax with it. On the sidewalk, a courier zipped past on an electric bike, the box strapped to his back wobbling dangerously as he weaved through pedestrians. A little boy pointed at him and shouted something, tugging at his mother's hand, but she didn't seem to hear. She was watching her phone instead, her thumb moving in smooth, practiced arcs over the screen. The boy gave up and stomped in a puddle, sending droplets flying. And for a second, the whole scene felt like it might dissolve into laughter or shouting or both. But nothing happened. The mother didn't notice. The courier didn't stop. The boy just kept stomping, each splash of protest only he could hear. I finished my coffee and left the cafe, stepping into the drizzle with my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The pavement gleamed like polished stone, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and exhaust. A man with a dog walked past me, and I noticed how the leash stretched taut between them, each tugging the other forward like an unspoken negotiation. Across the street, a flower vendor was setting up her stall, her movements brisk and precise as she arranged bursts of color against the gray morning. I paused at the corner to wait for the light. Beside me, two women stood chatting, their voices low but animated. One gestured with her hands, her silver bracelets jingling softly, while the other held a takeaway cup that she kept tipping but never drank from. Their conversation was nothing I could follow, just fragments caught and lost again in the wind, but it felt important, the kind of talk that binds people together in ways that matter more than the words themselves. When the light changed, the crowd surged forward, and I moved with it, carried along by the same unseen current. For a moment, I thought about all the tiny, unnoticed things that held us together. Threads so fine they were almost invisible, yet strong enough to weave this entire, messy world into something whole. I don't know if anyone else felt it, the strange, quiet magic of it all, but it left me wondering, what part of our everyday society makes you feel like a traveler in your own world? Let's start a new story. I used to think I was an observant person, someone who noticed the little things, who could tell you the shade of blue the sky was before the storm clouds rolled in, or pick out the faintest scent of cinnamon in a cup of coffee. And then, last Tuesday, a banana taught me otherwise. It started innocently enough. I was sitting at my desk, typing an email I'd been avoiding for days. One of those emails where every sentence feels like stepping through a social minefield. Too formal, and you're a robot. Too casual, and you're unprofessional. So naturally, I procrastinated by reaching for the banana sitting on the edge of my desk, a perfect little snack to distract me from my growing existential dread. Here's where things get weird. I peeled it, top to bottom, like any self-respecting human does, and I took a bite. It tasted fine, good even, but when I glanced down at the peel, I noticed something that made me stop mid-chew. Bananas have seams. Tiny little ridges running up and down the peel like it's wearing a suit. I must have peeled hundreds, maybe thousands of bananas in my lifetime, and yet I had never noticed this. Not once. The realization hit me like a truck. A fruit with seams? What else had I missed? Suddenly, I wasn't eating a banana anymore. I was on the verge of a philosophical breakdown, sitting there in my tiny apartment, staring at this ridiculous piece of fruit like it held the secrets of the universe. How could I have overlooked something so obvious? And if I'd missed this, what else had slipped by me? That thought dug its claws in. I started mentally cataloging every object in my apartment. Did my toaster have seams? My coffee mug? What about the couch cushions I sat on every day? I even checked the cat, who was unimpressed by my investigation and promptly swatted my hand. And here's the thing. Once I started looking, I found so many details I'd never noticed before. Like, did you know the screw on your kitchen cabinet has tiny little grooves that spiral in one direction? Or that the buttons on your TV remote are slightly concave, so your thumb naturally rests in them? These are the kinds of things that exist right in front of you, but are so mundane, so baked into the fabric of daily life, that your brain just glosses over them. By the time I finished the banana, I convinced myself I was in some kind of personal simulation, a version of The Truman Show where I'd been placed in a world made of beautifully detailed props I'd never bothered to appreciate. The seams on the banana were just the first crack in the illusion. Later that evening, I told my friend Molly about the whole thing. Molly is one of those people who can make any topic sound like a TED Talk, and she said something that made me pause. It's not that you've missed those details. It's that your brain only notices them when they matter. You were too busy trying to survive the email from hell to care about banana seams. Fair enough, but it still didn't explain why I suddenly cared so much now. So I did what any overly curious person would do. I went online and Googled banana seams. I fully expected to uncover some profound biological reason for their existence. What I found was underwhelming. Apparently, the seams are where the peel naturally splits apart when the fruit ripens. Simple, boring, anticlimactic even, but the thing is, I didn't feel disappointed. In fact, the explanation only made me more fascinated. Bananas didn't have to be this detailed. They could have been smooth, featureless blobs for all nature cared. But no, they came with seams like little zipper tracks to help us peel them. It was such a small, beautiful example of how nature quietly designs the world to work just so. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about how much of life is like that banana. How many tiny, intricate, perfect details we miss because we're too busy with emails and bills and existential dread. The thought wasn't depressing, though. It was kind of comforting, like the universe was saying, hey, take a closer look when you can. There's more here than you think. The next morning, I started noticing seams everywhere. The stitching on my jeans, the crease in the corner of my notebook where the paper folds, even the faint line where the sidewalk slabs meet, like a giant puzzle laid out just for us. And every time I spotted one, it made me smile. Because if something as ordinary as a banana could make me pause and appreciate the world, maybe there's a little magic tucked into everything. So now I have to ask, what's the last tiny, unexpected thing that made you stop and go, wait, how did I never notice this before? Let me know. I'm starting a list. Let's start a new story. Crush on someone. And I mean a real crush, not just, oh, they're cute and I'd swipe right. I get this absolutely uncontrollable urge to choreograph imaginary dances about them. Yeah, full-on, dramatic, Broadway-style dance numbers in my head. Before you ask, no, I'm not a dancer. I mean, I've seen Step Up like 100 times, but I'm the guy who trips over his own feet when he tries to moonwalk. Doesn't matter. The second I like someone, my brain says, congratulations. You are now a Tony Award-winning choreographer. Make it count. It's like the crush flips a switch, and suddenly I'm walking down the street with my AirPods in, imagining myself in some elaborate routine where we lock eyes across a crowded room. And BAM, the music swells. There's spinning. There's jazz hands. Maybe even a dramatic lift, even though I have the upper body strength of a wet noodle. The most absurd part? I'll choreograph these imaginary routines to the stupidest songs. Like, I once had a thing for this guy who worked at the bagel shop near my apartment. Dark curls, crooked smile, always remembered my order, everything bagel, toasted, extra cream cheese. My brain decided our imaginary love story needed to be told through an interpretive dance to Take a Chance on Me by ABBA. Picture me sliding across the flour-dusted floor, twirling an imaginary bagel in one hand like it's an Olympic ribbon. Pure caos. This whole thing started in middle school, when I had my first real crush on this girl named Jamie. She sat behind me in science class, smelled like strawberries, and doodled the most amazing dragons in her notebook. One day, we got paired for a group project, and I spent the entire time imagining us in a dramatic ballroom dance routine set to My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion. The grand finale? Me dipping her so low her Converse barely skimmed the gym floor. Spoiler alert, none of that happened. We built a baking soda volcano, and she told me I smelled like Doritos. But the choreography? Chef esquisse. Fast forward to adulthood, and it's only gotten worse. There was this girl at work, Ashley, who had this laugh that sounded like it belonged in a 1950s screwball comedy. Effortless, infectious, completely out of my league. One day, she came into the office wearing this yellow dress, and my brain immediately went, this calls for a tap dance routine. Suddenly, I'm sitting at my desk pretending to type an email, but really I'm imagining us dancing through the cubicles to Singin' in the Rain. She'd twirl in her dress. I'd dramatically leap onto someone's desk, and the whole office would burst into synchronized clapping. In real life, I awkwardly complimented her dress, and she said, "Thanks, it has pockets," while I nodded like an idiot. But the crown jewel of my imaginary choreographed disasters? That would be this guy I met on the metro. We were both crammed onto this crowded train, and he was holding a skateboard, looking all effortlessly cool in this worn-out denim jacket. I made the mistake of glancing at him for more than 2 seconds, which apparently activated my inner Fred Astaire. Suddenly, I was imagining us in a West Side Story-style dance-off, snapping our fingers in perfect rhythm as the whole train car exploded into a full ensemble number. In my head, we leapt from one end of the car to the other, dodging disgruntled commuters, until the big finale where he grabbed my hand, and we swung out of the closing doors in unison, landing on the platform with a flawless double pirouette. Reality check. The train stopped, he got off without a word, and I spent the rest of the ride staring at my reflection in the window, wondering why my brain was like this. Here's the thing, though. As ridiculous as these imaginary routines are, they're also kind of comforting. Like, life is messy and awkward, and I never have the guts to actually talk to these people. But in my head, I get to live out this perfect, ridiculous fantasy where I'm confident and charming and can somehow pull off a mid-air spin. For those 3 minutes in my head, I'm Gene Kelly. I'm Beyoncé. I'm that guy from The Greatest Showman who always lands on his feet. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think about actually doing it. Not the whole Broadway routine. That's a one-way ticket to getting banned from the bagel shop, but like taking a tiny piece of that confidence and using it to say something real. Maybe instead of choreographing an entire tap routine, I could just, I don't know, ask for their number? Or say, hey, you have a great smile, without fumbling over my words. But for now, I think I'll stick to the dances. Because honestly, the world in my head where everyone bursts into spontaneous choreography and nobody thinks it's weird is kind of a nice place to live. So, that's me, the hopeless romantic who processes crushes through imaginary dance routines. What about you? Do you have any completely irrational ways of dealing with your feelings? Like, do you write songs, paint portraits, or recite Shakespeare in the mirror? Please tell me I'm not the only one turning their love life into a Broadway flop. Let's start a new story. The night started with the smell of rain on asphalt and the promise of chaos. I hadn't planned on going out. I'd sworn off bars and their predictable rhythm of drinks, banter, and forgettable faces. But my best friend, Maya, had insisted, dragging me out with the persuasion only someone who knows your deepest weaknesses can muster. She'd smirked as she held up the black dress that always made me feel a little dangerous. Come on, she'd said. One drink won't kill you. Now, hours later, I was on my 3rd drink, standing under a string of fairy lights in the back garden of a bar I couldn't remember the name of. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the hum of laughter and clinking glasses swirled around me. That's when I saw him, not across the room or leaning suavely against the bar, but haggling with the bartender over whether the jukebox would accept quarters. He wasn't my type, too scruffy, too unpolished, with a leather jacket that looked like it had been through a war. But there was something magnetic about him. Maybe it was the way he laughed at himself when the bartender finally rolled their eyes and gave him change, or how his messy hair looked like it couldn't decide whether to be charming or ridiculous. Before I knew it, we were talking. He approached me with the confidence of someone who didn't care about looking cool, and I liked that. He didn't offer a cheesy pickup line or lean on some fake mystery. Instead, he asked if I thought it would rain again. I replied that it didn't matter because he'd brought the storm in with him. He groaned at my attempt at flirting, but his grin betrayed him. One conversation bled into another, and soon we were perched on mismatched chairs, swapping stories. He told me about the time he accidentally got stranded in a canoe during a camping trip and had to paddle back using a shoe. I told him about my failed attempt to bake bread during lockdown, which resulted in a rock-hard loaf my neighbors still joke about. The more we talked, the more it felt like the night was spinning just for us. At some point, he challenged me to a game of darts, and I accepted, knowing full well I was terrible. We turned it into a competition. Whoever lost had to share an embarrassing secret. Predictably, I lost almost every round, but I didn't mind. My confessions, like how I once accidentally texted a meme to my boss, seemed to amuse him endlessly. Then the music shifted. Someone had queued up a slower song, and the bar's energy softened. He leaned in closer, his voice lower now, asking if I wanted to step outside. The way he said it wasn't slick or rehearsed. It was tentative, like he genuinely wanted to see if I'd say yes. Outside, the rain had started again, a light drizzle that shimmered under the streetlights. We walked, no destination in mind, just letting the city guide us. At a quiet corner, he stopped and looked at me with a mixture of amusement and hesitation. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, like a teenager on a first date. And when he did, it was nothing like the sloppy, eager kisses of a drunken night out. It was deliberate, soft but certain, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment and didn't want to mess it up. I kissed him back, surprised at how natural it felt, like we were picking up a conversation we'd started in another life. The hours that followed were a blur of laughter, stolen kisses, and stories whispered under awnings to avoid the rain. At one point, we found ourselves in an all-night diner, eating greasy pancakes and joking about how the place probably hadn't been cleaned since the 80s. Eventually, as the city began to stir with early risers, we landed back at his apartment. It was small, cluttered in the way that made it feel lived in. There were books stacked in uneven piles, a guitar propped against the couch, and an old map of the world pinned crookedly to the wall. We didn't rush into anything, and for some reason, that felt more intimate than anything physical. We sat on his floor, backs against the couch, talking until the sunlight streamed through the blinds. He told me about the tattoo on his wrist, a constellation he'd gotten during a trip to Iceland, and I told him about the dream I'd had since childhood to see the northern lights. Eventually, the world caught up with us. My phone buzzed with messages from Maya, who was probably wondering if I'd been kidnapped. He walked me to the door, his hair even messier now than when I'd first seen him. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my hand and said, "I don't know if this is supposed to be a one-night thing, but I hope it isn't." I smiled, not trusting my voice to say anything that wouldn't sound overly sentimental. But as I walked down the stairs, my heart felt lighter than it had in months. Maybe it was just a single night, or maybe it was the start of something. Either way, it wasn't about where it would lead. It was about what it had reminded me. That connections can come out of nowhere, that the unexpected is worth embracing, and that sometimes the best moments in life are the ones you never see coming. Let's start a new story. A few times before, enough for me to know I liked the way he laughed at his own jokes and how his hands never seemed to know where to rest when he was nervous. He'd suggested this tiny ramen place tucked between a laundromat and a bike shop, a place I'd never heard of but instantly adored the second we walked in. The air was rich with the smell of broth, and the walls were plastered with postcards from travelers who'd eaten there over the years. "Best ramen in Tokyo," one had scrawled, though we were very clearly in a Chicago suburb. We ordered, and the conversation was easy at first. Work anecdotes, his weirdly extensive knowledge of bird migration patterns, the usual stuff. But then, halfway through his bowl, he set down his chopsticks and looked at me with this expression that made me feel like the only person in the room. "Can I ask you something kind of weird?" he said. I braced myself, because who doesn't when they hear that? But I nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth, flat stone about the size of a silver dollar. "If you had to guess," he said, "where do you think this rock has been?" I blinked, unsure if he was joking. But when I didn't laugh, he leaned forward, excitement flickering in his eyes. "I found it on a beach when I was 13, but I think it must have been somewhere amazing before that. Like buried under a castle, or carried in someone's pocket during a war. Maybe it was just part of a riverbed for centuries, slowly wearing down. What do you think?" It was the most random, childlike question I'd ever been asked on a date, and I couldn't help smiling. "I think," I said slowly, "it belonged to someone who used to skip stones on a lake every morning. Maybe they called it their lucky rock. Maybe they lost it when they threw it a little too far one day." His grin widened, and he tucked the stone back into his pocket like he was saving my answer for later. "That's a good story," he said almost reverently. Then, without missing a beat, he added, "I can show you the exact beach where I found it if you're ever up for a road trip." The rest of the night felt like some sort of secret game we were playing, where everything ordinary became extraordinary. He pointed out a crack in the table and said it looked like a lightning bolt frozen in time. I told him his ramen had the perfect swirl in the broth, like something out of a painting. And when it was time to leave, instead of just walking me to my car, he took a detour through an empty parking lot and taught me how to waltz under the flickering glow of a dying street lamp. The lesson was terrible. He kept stepping on my toes, and I couldn't stop laughing long enough to figure out where my hands were supposed to go. But when he spun me around and I stumbled right into his chest, neither of us moved for a moment. The world felt impossibly still, like even the street lamp was holding its breath. "You're terrible at this," he whispered, and I could feel his breath warm against my cheek. "You're not much better," I shot back, but my voice was softer than I'd meant it to be. We stood like that until the cold finally nudged us apart, and he walked me to my car with his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. Before I could open the door, he pulled the stone out again and placed it in my palm. "For you," he said, to add to the story. I wanted to say something, "Thank you," or "Are you sure," or anything that could capture the way my chest felt like it was blooming and breaking all at once. But all I managed was a quiet, "I'll take good care of it." When I got home, I sat in the dark for a while, turning the rock over and over in my hands. It wasn't much to look at, just a smooth, gray thing that could have been anywhere in anyone's hands. But it felt heavy with possibility, with the weight of all the places it had been and all the places it might still go. We're still adding to its story. It's been with us on road trips and hikes, tucked into my pocket at weddings and his during doctor's appointments. Sometimes, when life feels unbearably big, we pass it back and forth like a secret reminder that the ordinary things, rocks, ramen, waltzes under street lamps, are the ones that make everything extraordinary. Have you ever had a moment on a date that made the world feel new? Let's start a new story. I found myself marveling at the oddest thing last Tuesday. The ritual of sending "I'm outside" texts. You know the ones. Those little bursts of communication that announce someone's arrival at your home, as if the doorbell is some ancient relic no one dares use anymore. I'm guilty of it too. I'll text here to my best friend, even though I know she's been watching me approach on her video doorbell camera. There's something hilarious about it, like we're choreographing a scene for no one's benefit. Modern politeness, I guess. Or maybe it's just a way of pretending we're casual, when in reality, we're all a bit over-engineered now. Think about it. We've wrapped so much of life in this gentle layer of digital buffering. Once upon a time, if you were running late, you just were late. Now, you send a play-by-play. Stuck in traffic. Should be there in 5. Parking. It's like we've created tiny narration scripts for every non-event. It's charming in its own way. Like we're all broadcasting little radio dramas to each other about the epic odyssey of showing up. Then there's the weather. Oh, not the weather itself, but the way we experience it now. There was a time you'd step outside, look at the sky, and make a guess about whether you needed an umbrella. Today, my phone buzzes with severe storm alerts, pollen counts, UV indices, and air quality warnings. It's as though the weather has become a hyperactive meteorologist who doesn't want me to miss a single detail. And yet, despite all this intel, I still walk out in sneakers during downpours because the one notification I didn't get was "Remember, you're forgetful." Even our relationships with strangers have changed. I don't mean in the deep, profound sense. I'm talking about those little moments of connection that used to just happen, like chatting with someone at a bus stop or asking the barista how their day's going. Now, half the time, I'm busy making eye contact with someone over FaceTime while the real-life cashier hands me my latte, unnoticed. It's funny because it feels like we've traded breadth for depth. Less chit-chat with the world, more concentrated updates from people who know the exact contents of our fridge. Progress? Maybe. Cozy? Definitely. The way we eat is a saga of its own. There's this quiet joy in realizing how normalized it is to take pictures of your food. My grandmother still doesn't understand it. "Do you need a photo to remember the sandwich?" she'll ask, confused. But for me, it's less about the sandwich and more about preserving the moment. I can look at a picture of avocado toast and immediately remember the laughter at that brunch table or the sunlight streaming in through the window. Food, it seems, has become our shared scrapbook. Speaking of food, I find it delightful how snacks have become their own personality traits. Go on any dating app, and half the bios mention loving tacos or being obsessed with coffee. I wonder if future historians will look back and think the 21st century was defined by its deep, almost spiritual connection to guacamole. It's adorable, really, how we've turned small pleasures into ways to say, "This is who I am." And oh, the things we celebrate now. There's something refreshingly absurd about the rise of niche appreciation days. National Donut Day? I'm in. International Talk like a Pirate Day? Don't mind if I do. My favorite so far has been National Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day, during which I watched a grown man at work spend 20 solid minutes popping an entire roll. He looks so zen. For all our modern hustle and screens, there's still room for joy in the utterly pointless. Technology has also found ways to sneak into our most sacred traditions. Take gift giving. Once a tactile, messy affair of ribbons and paper cuts, now it's become a parade of tracking numbers and digital cards that say, "Your gift is on the way." On one hand, it's streamlined. On the other, I miss the suspense of guessing whether Aunt Linda sent socks or something wildly impractical. But then again, who am I to complain? Last Christmas, I sent my nephew a virtual reality headset without ever leaving the couch. The future is convenient and weirdly disembodied, like a magic trick we've all agreed not to question too hard. Of course, not all changes are about efficiency. Some are just fun, like the trend of soft quitting. Have you seen this? People don't storm out of jobs anymore. They make exit PowerPoints. I saw one on TikTok where a woman titled her resignation slide deck, "Reasons I'm Piecing Out," with bullet points like, "I'm too pretty for this and you never fix the coffee machine." It's petty and brilliant and such a perfect encapsulation of how humor keeps us sane. What fascinates me most, though, is how underneath all the gadgets and rituals, we're still the same creatures we've always been. We crave connection, we want to laugh, and we find meaning in the little things. Modern life is quirky and overcomplicated, sure, but it's also full of wonder. How incredible is it that we can send a song to someone across the world with a single tap? Or that we can befriend a stranger over shared love for the same obscure TV show? Sometimes I think about how my great-grandparents lived, and I wonder if they'd be horrified by all the screens or just impressed by how many cat videos we've managed to produce. So here's my thought. Modern life is a delightful, chaotic, tech-infused dance, and it's okay to both marvel at it and laugh at its oddities. What's something about today's world that makes you stop and smile? Maybe it's a habit, a gadget, or just a moment that feels wonderfully human in the midst of all this progress. Share your magic. Let's start a new story. Feel impossibly alive. Not the gray drizzle that dampens spirits, but a torrential burst, soaking the earth with reckless abandon. The sky was an electric shade of charcoal, but through it, sunlight fractured into scattered beams, lighting up droplets like diamonds. It was as if the weather couldn't decide whether to mourn or celebrate, so it chose both. I had planned to stay inside. The sensible thing, I thought, was to curl up with a book and a blanket, letting the rain soundtrack my retreat. But then, in one of those inexplicable flashes of impulse, I grabbed my boots and stepped outside. It wasn't a decision as much as a surrender to something bigger, a magnetic pull. The rain felt warm on my skin, and the smell of wet pavement mixed with the earthy sweetness of spring was intoxicating. My feet carried me to the edge of town, to a trail I'd never walked before. It wound upward, past a crumbling stone wall, and into a forest that seemed to hum with life. The rain had softened into a mist, hanging like a veil between the trees, and the air was filled with the sound of water dripping from leaves. Every step felt deliberate, like I was moving through a story I hadn't written but was somehow meant to live. I came to a clearing where an old, gnarled tree stood at its center, its roots twisting above ground like veins. Beneath it sat a woman, her clothes patchworked and her hair a halo of wild curls streaked with silver. She looked like she belonged there, as much a part of the landscape as the tree itself. In her hands was a violin, and though she wasn't playing, I could see the marks on her fingers, the way her grip held the instrument as if it were an extension of herself. "Lost? Or looking?" she asked without looking up, her voice low and musical. "Neither," I replied, though the truth was somewhere in between. She studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if my answer satisfied her. Without another word, she raised the violin to her shoulder and began to play. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, haunting, tender, and ancient, as if the forest itself had given her its voice. The melody wound around me, tugging at memories I didn't know I had, and for a moment, I forgot where I was, who I was. There was only the music. When she stopped, it was so abrupt it felt like the world had exhaled. I didn't know what to say, so I simply stood there, feeling raw and exposed, as if she'd seen something in me even I didn't understand. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and gestured toward the path beyond the clearing. I didn't ask what was ahead, I just followed. The trail led to a hidden lake, its surface perfectly still, mirroring the sky so precisely it was like standing at the edge of a portal. A rowboat, small and weathered, was tethered to a crooked dock. On impulse, I stepped into it, untying the rope and letting the boat drift. The water was so calm it felt like I was floating on air, suspended between two worlds. At the lake center, I saw something peculiar, a single lantern hanging from a pole on a tiny wooden platform. Its flame flickered, defying the damp air, and beneath it sat an envelope, weighted down by a smooth, flat stone. I pulled the boat closer and hesitated before picking up the envelope. My name was written on the front in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, simply, "Keep going. You're closer than you think." It didn't make sense, but somehow it felt like it did. The words were for me, though I couldn't have said why or from whom. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the lantern casting its warm glow over the water as the sun dipped below the horizon. When I finally returned to the dock, the path was different, winding through a meadow alive with fireflies. They blinked and danced like stars, guiding me back toward the town. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the rain had stopped, and the sky was a deep, velvety blue. The town looked different in the moonlight, quieter, softer, as if it had been waiting for me to see it this way. I walked past the familiar streets, feeling an ache in my chest that was equal parts longing and contentment, like I'd touched something infinite but couldn't hold on to it. When I finally reached my doorstep, I found another envelope tucked into the frame of the door. This one simply said, "Today was the prelude. Don't stop listening for the song." I don't know who left it or how they knew where I'd been, but that night, as I lay in bed, I felt the echoes of the violin, the words, the lake, the lantern, all of it threading through me like a melody. The kind you can't quite hum, but can't forget. Have you ever had a day when it felt like life was pulling you by the hand, showing you its hidden corners and whispering secrets only you could understand? When it felt like the world had written a song and you were finally, truly listening? Let's start a new story. I was walking home after dark, the kind of evening where the air feels soft and weightless, and everything glows faintly from streetlights. It hit me somewhere between the corner deli and my building, a faint, earthy scent mingled with something metallic, like warm pennies in your palm. I stopped mid-step, sniffing like an idiot trying to pin it down. It wasn't the trees lining the sidewalk or the deli's greasy waft of fried food. It was something deeper, something that pulled me somewhere else. And then it clicked. Sparklers. That smell was sparklers burning down to the wire, smoky and sharp, but also sweet somehow, like they were carrying the whispers of every 4th of July I'd ever spent in the backyard with my cousins. My mouth opened a little in shock, and suddenly I wasn't on my street anymore. I was barefoot on damp grass, standing in the back of my grandparents' house, surrounded by the glow of fireflies and the soft buzz of summer nights. I remember my cousin Natalie waving a sparkler and looping, lazy circles, the light tracing trails of fire against the black sky. My grandpa sat on the porch with a beer, smiling in his quiet, steady way. Someone, it must have been my uncle, was arguing with my dad about whether the charcoal was hot enough to start grilling. That night smelled like burnt wire, bug spray, and the lingering sweetness of melted marshmallows from earlier. I must have stood frozen on the sidewalk for a solid minute, breathing it all in like the memory had a scent of its own. A car honked somewhere behind me, breaking the spell, and I shook my head to clear it. The moment was gone, but a piece of it clung to me as I walked the rest of the way home, my steps a little slower now. Back in my apartment, I dropped my bag by the door and didn't bother turning on the lights. The quiet felt right somehow. I sank onto the couch, still caught up in the strange pull of that smell, when I noticed a small box sticking out from under the coffee table. It wasn't unusual. My apartment's a perpetual game of find the thing I forgot I owned, but this one wasn't mine. It was taped shut, and across the top was my name in black Sharpie, written in a hand I hadn't seen in years. My mom must have left it there on her last visit. She's always trying to declutter the house I grew up in, sneaking old things into my apartment like she's returning them to the rightful owner. I sighed and peeled the tape back. Inside were the oddest assortment of things. A handful of old photos, a small plastic dinosaur missing an arm, a cassette tape I couldn't play, and a battered little kaleidoscope with the paint mostly chipped off. The kaleidoscope was mine. I hadn't thought about it in years, but as soon as I held it, I could feel the smooth metal barrel warming in my palm like it used to when I was 6, sitting cross-legged on the floor. I used to spin it endlessly, tilting it this way and that, watching the glass shards inside shift into infinite dazzling patterns. My favorite thing was to aim it at the sunlit windows. The colors always seemed more alive that way. I couldn't resist. I held it up to my eye, even though I knew the plastic had long since clouded, and the colors would be muted. But the moment I looked through it, something strange happened. The room melted away. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was lying on my back in my childhood bedroom, kaleidoscope held up against the late afternoon sun, turning it over and over while my favorite song played faintly from the CD player on my desk. The smell of the sparklers came rushing back, joined by the plasticky scent of a brand new slip, slide we'd unpacked that morning, and the tangy zing of lemonade on my tongue. I could even hear the old whir of the ceiling fan overhead, the lazy hum filling the quiet between moments. For the second time that night, I just froze. I didn't even blink. I wanted to stay in that memory forever. I wanted to feel the prickly texture of the carpet under my hands, hear my mom calling me to come set the table, smell the faint trace of my dad's cologne on his jacket slung over a chair. But memories don't work like that, do they? They give you a taste, just enough to make you ache for more, then slip away before you can catch them. When I finally blinked, the kaleidoscope was just a toy again, scuffed and dull, no longer capable of its old magic. I set it down gently, like it might break under the weight of the nostalgia now wrapped around it, and leaned back against the couch. I didn't need to look through it again. The memory was still there, alive and humming in the back of my mind, filling the room with quiet echoes. It's funny, isn't it? How the smallest, most unexpected things can crack you open like that. A smell, a sound, even a beat-up toy. It's like they hold pieces of you in their hands, waiting for you to stumble across them so they can say, remember? This is who you were. This is still part of who you are. So now I'm sitting here with a kaleidoscope on my lap, wondering what else is out there in the world waiting to remind me of something I've forgotten. And I want to ask you, what small, randomly found things bring you back? What's your version of sparklers, or a kaleidoscope, or a box of strange little treasures? Let's start a new story. The day started with a busted coffee machine. Not just any coffee machine. My coffee machine, the one I'd had since college, complete with its clunky buttons and permanently coffee-stained carafe. I should have known it was a bad omen, but at the time, I just shrugged it off, grabbed a thermos of yesterday's cold brew, and hit the road. I was headed to a tiny coastal town I'd never been to, chasing some vague desire to see what else was out there. It wasn't supposed to be an adventure, just a quick overnight trip to clear my head. But life apparently had other plans. About halfway there, I realized I'd missed my turn. The GPS had rerouted me down a stretch of road that felt like it hadn't seen another car in decades. No cell service, no gas stations, not even a mailbox. Just miles of trees leaning into the road like they were gossiping about me. It would have been eerie if it weren't so beautiful. Then, of course, my car decided this was the perfect moment to cough twice and die on the spot. I got out and stared at the hood like I knew what I was doing, which I didn't. Somewhere in the trees, a bird made a sound that could have been laughing at me, and I decided then and there I hated nature. I gave the car one last hopeless look, grabbed my bag, and started walking. I didn't have a clue where I was going, but standing still didn't feel like an option. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, I came across a weathered wooden sign with the words Linden Market painted in peeling blue letters. A path led up to what looked like a tiny general store, tucked between two massive oaks. I almost didn't go inside because it seemed too perfect, like the setting for a horror movie where the shopkeeper is secretly a cannibal. But I was thirsty, and the sun was unforgiving, so I pushed open the door. The bell above the door jingled, and a man behind the counter looked up. He was maybe 60, with wild silver hair and a face that seemed permanently amused. The store itself was packed with an absurd mix of items: dusty canned goods, hand-carved wooden figurines, fishing poles, and for some reason, a rack of brightly colored Hawaiian shirts. It smelled like cinnamon and old books. "Car trouble?" the man asked, like he already knew the answer. "Yeah," I said, eyeing a display of homemade jams. "I don't suppose you know where I can find a mechanic?" "Depends," he said, his grin widening. "How good are you at playing poker?" I blinked, wondering if the heat was getting to me. "Poker. Wednesday is poker night," he said, as if that explained anything. "Mechanic's my cousin. He'll fix your car if I ask, but you gotta play a hand or two first. House rules." At this point, I figured I had nothing to lose. So, I followed him through a door at the back of the store into a dimly lit room that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. A round table sat in the middle, surrounded by a mismatched set of chairs. 3 other people were already there: an older woman in a red cowboy hat, a guy in a fishing vest, and a teenager with earbuds who looked utterly bored. "New player," the man announced, pulling out a chair for me. "Don't worry, we don't play for money." "What do you play for?" I asked, sitting down cautiously. "Favors," the woman in the cowboy hat said, dealing the cards. Her voice was smooth and rich, like she should have been narrating documentaries. "You win, you get something useful. You lose, you owe something useful." I considered bolting, but stayed put, mostly because I was intrigued. What followed was the most bizarre poker game of my life. I lost the first hand and ended up promising to taste test a batch of experimental candy the man had been working on. It was terrible, but politely so. The teenager lost the second hand and had to agree to mow the man's lawn for a week. By the time I went around, I'd almost forgotten about my car. "Your favor?" the man asked, leaning back in his chair with a sly smile. "Fix my car," I said, trying to sound confident even though my heart was racing. "Done," he said, as if he'd expected it all along. But the night wasn't over. After the game, they insisted I stay for dinner, which turned out to be a potluck feast like something out of a storybook. We ate under a string of fairy lights in the backyard, surrounded by fireflies and the smell of grilled vegetables. The cowboy hat lady brought a mandolin and played songs that sounded older than time, while the fishing vest guy told wild stories about a giant catfish he swore was the size of a bear. Even the teenager cracked a smile. When the stars came out, the man, who finally introduced himself as Gus, offered me a hammock strung between 2 trees. "Your car will be ready by morning," he promised. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. True to his word, Gus's cousin had fixed my car and even cleaned the windshield, though he left a note suggesting I learn how to change a tire. As I got ready to leave, Gus handed me a jar of his homemade jam, blackberry, my favorite, and said, "Come back anytime, and bring your poker face." Driving away, I felt like I'd stepped out of a dream, one of those weird and wonderful ones that sticks with you. I never did figure out how Gus and his friends managed to run a store, a mechanic shop, and a makeshift restaurant in the middle of nowhere. But sometimes it's better not to ask. Some things are best left as mysteries that make you smile when you think about them later. Have you ever stumbled into a place or moment that felt too strange and perfect to be real? Let's start a new story. There's a kind of magic in small, ordinary moments that only hits you in hindsight, like the punchline of a joke you didn't know you were part of. For me, that moment happened in a grocery store on a Wednesday night. A night so uneventful, I wasn't even wearing real shoes, just those beat-up flip-flops I'd been meaning to throw out. I was there to buy bananas and maybe some cereal, the kind of errand you barely register because it's so routine. But by the end of it, I'd had a brush with destiny, or at least a kind of fate that smells faintly like lemons and embarrassment. It started in the cleaning aisle. I wasn't even supposed to be there, but the bananas were on the other side of the store, and I have the attention span of a ferret. So I wandered, poking at bottles of glass cleaner and wondering why anyone needs lavender-scented bleach. That's when I saw him, a guy crouched on the floor, wrestling with a bottle of dish soap that had somehow exploded in his hands. He was mid-battle, trying to wipe the soap off his jeans with those tiny, useless napkins grocery stores keep at the sample stands, when we made eye contact. "Rough day?" I asked because my brain decided this was the time to be witty. "You have no idea," he said, holding up the sudsy bottle like it was Exhibit A in the trial of his life. "I didn't even need dish soap. I just bumped into the shelf, and now I smell like a lemony nightmare." I laughed, and for some reason, that laugh was like opening a floodgate. He started telling me how his whole day had been a disaster. A missed alarm, a coffee spill, a boss who sent him 6 emails in a row with the subject line, "Urgent." It was the kind of small talk that feels oddly personal, like we'd skipped the part where you pretend to care about the weather and gone straight to the messier parts of life. Somewhere in the middle of his story about accidentally sending a typo-riddled email to his entire department, I realized we were still standing there, surrounded by cleaning supplies, as if the rest of the world had paused to let us have this moment. He was funny in that self-deprecating way that makes you want to root for someone, even when they're covered in soap. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed a box of those wet floor signs and said, "Let's make this official. Warning, spillage ahead." I set the sign next to his puddle of dish soap, and he laughed so hard I thought he might cry. Then we both kind of froze, realizing we were 2 strangers laughing over a mess in a grocery store, and the absurdity of it just made us laugh harder. Eventually, an employee came by with a mop, giving us a look that said, "Move along, weirdos," and the moment broke. I expected that to be it. A fleeting, funny interaction that would dissolve like so many others. But as we walked toward the checkout lanes, he turned to me and said, "You know, this was the best part of my day. Thanks for that." I smiled, feeling unexpectedly warm inside. "Well, if you ever need a grocery store sidekick, you know where to find me." He grinned, and then, in a move so smooth I almost tripped over my flip-flops, he wrote his name and number on the back of a receipt and handed it to me. "In case I run into more soap-related emergencies," he said before disappearing into the parking lot. I didn't call him. Not because I didn't want to, but because some moments feel like they're meant to live in the context they happened in. A grocery store, a spill, a laugh that made you forget how heavy the day had been. I kept that receipt for years, though, tucked into the corner of a journal I don't write in nearly enough. What I learned that night wasn't profound, but it stuck with me. Sometimes the universe gives you a little nudge, a reminder that life is less about avoiding messes and more about the people who help you laugh your way through them. Whether it's a stranger covered in soap or an old friend who shows up with a joke when you're feeling low, those are the moments that shine. So now I'm curious. Have you ever had an encounter like that? Something fleeting but unexpectedly meaningful. A stranger, a small kindness, or even just a laugh in the middle of a mess. I'd love to hear your story. Who knows? Maybe your grocery store moment is waiting to happen. Let's start a new story. This morning, my bedroom was flooded with a light that wasn't quite sunlight. It was softer, thicker, like melted butter poured through a sieve of golden thread. It pooled in corners, lazily stretching itself across the ceiling, and I could swear it sighed when I finally opened my eyes. The light said, "Oh, good, you're up. You're going to love today," in a voice that wasn't a voice, but more of a feeling that landed somewhere between a hug and the sound of a harp string snapping. I blinked back at it, wondering if I should say something polite. Instead, I waved weakly and rolled out of bed. When I opened my closet, it hummed at me, a low, contented sound, like the buzz of a bumblebee the size of a car, deep and resonant. I reached for a sweater, but it shivered under my hand and pulled itself back on the hanger. "Not me," it murmured. Too gloomy. After a bit of back-and-forth negotiation, I settled on a soft green cardigan that smelled faintly of pine cones and wore itself over my shoulders like it had been waiting all my life for this moment. The closet hummed its approval and shut itself behind me, satisfied. Outside, the world was awake in a way it had never been before. The sky wasn't just blue, it was alive. It rippled, rolling waves of periwinkle and azure crashing into each other, as if an invisible painter couldn't quite decide on the perfect shade. The air smelled like possibilities, which is to say it was both sweet and sharp, like the first bite of an apple you've never tasted before. My garden had taken liberties in my absence. The tulips had uprooted themselves and were having a rather animated debate about metaphysics near the mailbox, while the lavender sprawled across the lawn, sunbathing with abandon. The tulips stopped arguing as soon as they saw me. Finally, one of them exclaimed, "Do you even realize what time it is? We've been waiting hours." "For what?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. "To ask you something important," said another, taller tulip, straightening up with an air of authority. "What is the sound of a shadow falling?" I didn't have a good answer, so I shrugged and said, "Probably a soft thud." The tulips gasped as though I'd just revealed the secrets of the universe and promptly fell back into heated discussion. I left them to it and headed down the street. The sidewalk beneath my feet was warm, and each step released a new scent: honey, fresh rain, lemon verbena. A man jogging past me didn't say a word but glanced at me with a look so full of understanding that it was like he'd read every diary I'd never written. "Great sweater," he thought of me. I sent back, "Thanks, it picked itself." He laughed without moving his mouth and waved before disappearing around the corner. The trees along the path weren't swaying so much as dancing. Their branches twisted and turned in fluid choreography, and as I passed, a low-hanging branch brushed my cheek like a gentle kiss. "Keep going," it whispered. "Something wonderful's ahead." The trees were notoriously cryptic, but I liked their vibe, so I gave the branch a quick pat and kept walking. At the park, a small crowd had gathered to watch a bench giving a performance. The bench, slightly weathered but holding its own, was reciting poetry in a voice as deep as the ocean and twice as vast. The poem was about an acorn falling in love with a thunderstorm, and by the time the bench got to the part where the acorn shattered in the rain, at least 3 pigeons were crying. The applause was thunderous, though the only ones clapping were the leaves. I was about to head back home when a patch of sunlight on the ground caught my eye. It was too bright, too vivid, like it was trying to get my attention. When I stepped into it, the world tilted, not violently, but like a teacup tipping over in slow motion. Suddenly, I wasn't in the park anymore. I was somewhere else. The air here was thicker, like it was filled with syrup, and the colors were so intense they almost hummed. A figure approached me, tall, glowing faintly, and wearing a suit made entirely of stars. When it spoke, its voice sounded like the echoes of every bedtime story I'd ever heard. "Welcome," it said. "We don't get many visitors." "Where is this?" I asked, trying not to panic. "Wherever you need it to be," it replied, smiling a smile that could have cracked the moon in half. "But for now, you can call it the in-between." I wanted to ask more, but the figure raised a hand and said, "Don't think too hard. Just enjoy it." Then it snapped its fingers, and I was back on the sidewalk outside my house, as if nothing had happened. By the time I returned home, the tulips had declared my answer to their shadow question philosophically sound, and were holding a celebratory picnic. The lavender was still lounging on the lawn, looking deeply satisfied with its existence. Inside, my teapot poured me a cup of tea without me asking, and when I took a sip, it tasted like sunlight on water. I don't know what today was about or why any of it happened, but as I climbed into bed and felt the light tuck me in with a warm, golden blanket, I decided it didn't really matter. The rules of the world might have changed, but in some strange, inexplicable way, they felt like they made more sense than ever. So, what about you? If the world went soft around the edges and started playing by a new set of rules, how would you spend your day? Would you answer the tulips' riddles, or step into the in-between, or let the light sing you to sleep? Tell me your version. I'm curious. Let's start a new story. It began with a sock. A single, bright purple sock with neon green polka dots, lying in the middle of the sidewalk. It was so ridiculously out of place against the dull gray of the concrete that I stopped to stare at it. I don't know why I found it so captivating. Maybe it was the absurdity of such an obnoxiously cheerful thing in such a drab spot, or maybe it was just the kind of day where you notice odd details. Either way, I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I saw the penny. It was heads up, gleaming like it had been polished that morning, resting in the crook of a crack in the pavement. Without thinking, I pocketed it because, hey, luck is luck, and stood up to find the sock had vanished. Not blown away, not snagged by someone else, just gone. I glanced around, mildly confused but not enough to linger, and continued walking. The penny wasn't in my pocket when I got home. I swear I put it there. I even checked twice, thoroughly, patting myself down like an idiot. Nothing. That should have been the end of it, but later that night, when I was lying in bed, I heard a faint clinking noise. It sounded like coins being dropped into a jar, though I didn't own a jar like that, and it was coming from the living room. When I went to check, the sound stopped the moment I switched on the light. Everything was normal, my tiny apartment looking as unremarkable as ever, except for one thing. The purple sock was on the coffee table, folded neatly, as if it had always belonged there. I didn't touch it at first. I just stood there, staring, because what does one even do with a sock that follows you home? After about a solid minute of internal debate, I grabbed it, held it up, and examined it like some kind of amateur detective. Nothing. It was just a sock. No tags, no secret compartments, no glowing runes. I tossed it onto the floor, turned out the light, and went back to bed. The next morning, it was back on the table. Folded. Neat. This time, there was a folded note tucked into it, written on old parchment that smelled faintly of citrus. The handwriting was tiny, spidery, and completely illegible except for 3 words at the very bottom. Drop another penny. Now listen, I'm not the kind of person who usually entertains weirdness. I don't buy into urban legends or TikTok rituals. But something about that note got under my skin. Maybe it was the smell of citrus. It felt too specific, too intentional, or maybe it was just curiosity outweighing common sense. Whatever it was, I found myself at the corner store, buying a roll of pennies. Back on the sidewalk where I'd found the first sock, I flipped a penny into the air and let it land with a soft plink. Nothing happened. I felt ridiculous. But then, just as I was about to leave, a breeze kicked up, and with it came the faint scent of lavender. It wasn't the natural kind either. It was thick, perfumey, like the kind my grandma used to keep in little sachets in her drawers. I followed it, because what else does one do in a moment like that? The lavender smell led me to an alley I'd never noticed before. It wasn't grimy like alleys should be. The walls were covered in mosaics made of shattered tiles, depicting all sorts of strange things. A fox playing chess, a mermaid in a suit holding a coffee cup, a clock with all its numbers jumbled at the bottom. At the end of the alley stood an old vending machine, the kind that probably hadn't worked in decades. Its paint was peeling, and its buttons were scuffed, but the little sign above it glowed faintly, Sock Exchange. I laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. This was absurd, right? But I dug the purple sock out of my bag. Yes, I brought it, just in case, and fed it into the slot. The machine whirred to life with a groan, and the display lit up, select and upgrade. There were 4 options: time delay, coin magnetism, small favors, and lost things. I had no idea what any of it meant, but my thumb hovered over lost things because, let's face it, who doesn't want to find something they've lost? The machine clunked, and out dropped another sock, orange this time, with tiny yellow stars. Another note was tucked inside, this one saying, "You'll need this soon." I stepped back, clutching the sock like it was a winning lottery ticket. The lavender smell was gone. The mosaics didn't shimmer the way they had before, and the alley just looked ordinary. But something felt different, lighter, like the air had shifted, and I'd stepped into a slightly different version of the world. Over the next few weeks, weird things kept happening. I started finding pennies in the strangest places. One in my shoe, one in the refrigerator, one stuck to the bathroom mirror. And every time I picked one up, the orange sock would end up somewhere new, with another cryptic note inside. Check the library. Take a left at the bakery. Wear blue on Wednesday. I didn't understand it, but I followed the notes because what else was I going to do? And every time I did, something small but extraordinary would happen. I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. I found a bracelet I'd lost as a kid in a thrift store bin. Once, I even caught a bus I didn't know existed, which somehow took me to the perfect spot to watch the most stunning sunset I'd ever seen. It wasn't until I found the final sock, a green one with silver stripes, that I realized the game was over. The note inside simply said, "That's enough for now. Don't forget to look up." And when I did, for the first time in ages, I saw the stars. Let's start a new story. It started with a creaky old vending machine in the corner of a gas station, the kind that looked more decorative than functional. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My phone had rerouted me due to construction on my usual route, and I was running on fumes. I pulled into the station, threw my wallet at the pump, and wandered inside while the gas flowed, figuring I'd grab something sugary to survive the last leg of my drive. That's when I saw it. The vending machine was older than old. The faded logo on the side had peeled so badly I couldn't tell what it was advertising. Half the buttons were cracked, and a handwritten sign on it said, "Magic Soda, $2" in wobbly sharp letters. I stared at it for longer than I should have, trying to gauge whether this was some kind of prank or just the world's most misguided marketing scheme. Either way, I was intrigued. I dug out 2 crumpled bills and fed them into the slot. The machine groaned like I'd just insulted its family, but it finally spit out a can. It was warm, no label, just a silver can with the word "Try Me" scrawled across it in black marker. I couldn't decide if I was more amused or slightly unnerved. But hey, I was tired, and I'd spent the money, so I cracked it open. The first sip was weird. Not bad, just indescribable. It didn't taste like cola or fruit or anything I'd ever had before. It was familiar and foreign all at once, like drinking a memory I couldn't place. Before I could think too hard about it, the gas pump clicked, signaling it was done. I shoved the can in my cup holder and hit the road. That's when things started to get strange. About a mile down the road, I noticed a hitchhiker up ahead. Now, I never pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror movies, I guess, but something about this guy caught my attention. He wasn't waving or sticking out his thumb. He was just standing there, looking up at the sky with his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. I slowed down, and before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled over. He slid into the passenger seat without a word. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, with the kind of face you forget as soon as you stop looking at it. He didn't seem particularly grateful or even surprised, just sort of there. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice low and calm. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He shrugged. "Same direction as you, I guess." For the first few minutes, we didn't talk. I didn't feel scared exactly, just aware that I'd done something I wouldn't normally do. He glanced at the soda can in my cup holder and said, "You drank that?" I nodded. "Weird taste, huh?" Before I could ask how he knew that, he smiled and said, "You're in it now." I laughed, even though nothing about this felt like a joke. "In what?" I asked. He didn't answer, just turned to look out the window as if that explained everything. A few miles later, we passed a field. Except it wasn't a field anymore. It was an ocean. The road cut through it like it always had, but where there should have been dry grass and power lines, there were waves stretching out to the horizon. The water was impossibly blue, shimmering like liquid light. And the craziest part? The car wasn't wet. The tires splashed through the waves like they weren't even there. I slammed on the brakes, but the hitchhiker just chuckled. "Relax," he said. "It's just the soda." "What?" I snapped, panic bubbling in my chest. "What does that even mean?" He turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "You drank it, right? That means you're in the story now. You get to see the seams." "The seams?" My voice cracked. "What the hell are you talking about?" He sighed, like he'd explained this 100 times before. "You ever read a book so good it feels like you're living it? That soda works the other way around. It pulls back the curtain, lets you peek behind the story you're in." I stared at him, trying to decide whether I was dreaming, hallucinating, or just flat out losing it. "And you?" I asked. "What are you?" He grinned, and for a split second, his face wasn't a face at all. It was shifting shapes and colors, like TV static but alive. Then it snapped back to normal. "Just a fellow traveler," he said. I wanted to turn around, to drive back to the gas station and demand some kind of explanation, but the ocean was gone now, replaced by a desert I didn't recognize. The hitchhiker pointed ahead. "Keep going. You'll understand soon." Against every instinct, I did. The landscape shifted every few miles. Forests, cities, endless skies filled with stars. But none of it felt scary anymore. It felt right, like I was meant to see it. Finally, we reached a bridge that seemed to stretch forever, disappearing into the horizon. The hitchhiker opened the door and stepped out. "This is my stop," he said. "Wait," I called after him. "What do I do now?" He smiled again, that strange, knowing smile. "You'll figure it out." Then he pointed to the can still sitting in my cup holder. "Don't forget to share." And just like that, he was gone. The road ahead looked normal again, like nothing had happened. But I still had the can. And every now and then, when I see someone who looks like they need a little magic, I think about stopping, handing it over, and letting them take a sip. Have you ever felt like the world pulled back the curtain, just for a moment, to let you see the seams? Let's start a new story. So, here's a confession that might make you question my grip on reality. When I have a crush, I unintentionally turn them into a character in an imaginary sitcom starring. Well, me. It's not like I set out to do this. It just happens. One moment, they're a cute stranger at the bookstore or someone from my friend group. And the next, they're the supporting lead in a multi-camera romantic comedy that exists entirely in my head. I call it Crush Life. Think Friends, but with more awkward pauses and worse wardrobe choices. Here's how it goes. Let's say there's this guy, hypothetically of course, who works at the bakery down the street. He has floppy hair, a smile that could melt butter, and this habit of writing little doodles on my coffee cup when I order. His real name could be something perfectly respectable like Ryan or Elliot, but the moment he catches my eye, my brain rebrands him as Bread Chad, and suddenly he's the main character in Season 3 of Crush Life. Bread Chad isn't just selling croissants anymore. Oh no. In my sitcom world, he's this charmingly clumsy baker who keeps getting flour on his face while nervously asking me if I prefer scones or muffins. There's a laugh track and everything. Here's the kicker. I start casting myself in these episodes too. Like now I'm not just a random customer buying a baguette. I'm the quirky, slightly chaotic romantic lead who's always accidentally dropping her phone or saying something ridiculous like, "Do you think Bread has feelings?" True story. I actually said that once, and Bread Chad looked at me like I was an escape lab experiment. The worst part is, I start acting in real life like we're already in Act 2 of some grand romance. Even though we've barely exchanged more than a good morning. It gets weirder. I also start making up theme songs for these little sitcoms. I won't sing them out loud, obviously, but in my head, they're fully produced. The Bread Chad one went something like, "She's a girl who can't bake to save her life. He's the boy who needs his way through strife." You know, stupid but catchy. And when I see him, the song kicks in like it's his personal anthem. I can't help it. It's involuntary at this point. There was this one time it got completely out of hand. I had this massive crush on a guy in my college theater group. Let's call him Stage Dan. He was ridiculously good at accents, and my brain decided that his whole character arc was that he was secretly British but too embarrassed to tell anyone. In my imaginary sitcom, there was this big reveal episode where he accidentally let the accent slip while confessing his undying love for me in the middle of rehearsal. Like full-on Hugh Grant, stammering out, I think you're brilliant, and I can't keep pretending I'm from Chicago." Cue audience applause and a close-up of me looking adorably shocked. The reality? Stage Dan once asked me if I had a spare pencil and called me dude. That was the extent of our romance. My Crush Life quirk isn't just limited to nicknames and theme songs, though. Oh no, it gets worse. I also script imaginary dialogue for how I think conversations should go. So when the actual interactions inevitably fall short, it's like a bad improv show where no one got the memo. Once I planned this whole exchange where Bread Chad would compliment my scarf, and I'd say, "Oh, thanks. It's hand-knitted." And then he'd ask, "By you?" And I'd laugh and say, "No, but I do know how to crochet." And then he'd say, "Wow, you're full of surprises." In reality, the only thing he ever said about my scarf was, "Careful, it's dragging in the cream cheese." End scene. But the thing is, I kind of love this little quirk of mine. It's embarrassing and silly, sure, but it makes me feel alive in a way that logic and reason never do. It's like my brain refuses to accept that life is boring sometimes, so it keeps adding these ridiculous flourishes to spice things up. And honestly, it's kind of fun, even if nothing ever happens with Bread Chad or Stage Dan or the countless other characters who've starred in my imaginary rom-coms. The stories I create feel like little adventures. And who doesn't need a bit of adventure, even if it's just in your head? So now it's your turn. Do you have any romantic quirks like this? Weird rituals? Bizarre thoughts? Please tell me I'm not the only one whose love life looks like an episode of TV that no network would ever greenlight. Let's start a new story. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, mind you, just the kind that blurs into every other weekday, smudged with the same mundane tasks and routines. I was walking home from work, balancing a paper bag of groceries in one arm and trying to swipe a notification off my phone with the other. It was cold enough for my breath to hang in the air, but not so cold that I wished I'd brought gloves. Just one of those uneventful in-between days when life feels neither here nor there. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was someone's ringtone, a tinny, cheerful tune spilling out of a nearby window or a passing car. But it wasn't a modern sound. It was my sound, the unmistakable jingle of the ice cream truck that used to roll through my neighborhood when I was a kid. My feet froze on the sidewalk as if that song had wrapped invisible strings around them. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, like my brain was playing some weird nostalgia trick on me. But no, it was real. I turned slowly, scanning the street, and there it was. The truck, white with peeling rainbow decals and faded pictures of cartoon characters holding popsicles. The kind of truck that seemed like it had existed forever, traveling through neighborhoods on an endless loop, immune to time or trends. I didn't even think. I just started walking toward it, groceries forgotten at my side. My pulse was doing something strange, like it couldn't decide whether to speed up or slow down. The closer I got, the more impossible it felt. This wasn't just any ice cream truck. It was the ice cream truck, the same one that had parked at the end of my cul-de-sac every summer evening when I was 7. The same scratched window where Mr. Ronnie, with his wide-brimmed hat and gap-toothed grin, used to hand me my favorite treat, a Choco Taco. Always a Choco Taco. I reached the truck and stopped. My hands gripped the grocery bag like a lifeline because my brain couldn't quite process what was happening. The truck looked ancient now, like it had been dug out of the earth and dusted off just for this moment. But the music was clear as a bell, and behind the glass, there was a figure. Not Mr. Ronnie. This person was younger, a wiry man with a shock of gray in his hair and a slightly wary look, as if he wasn't sure why someone my age was staring at his truck like it had just fallen out of the sky. Can I help you?" he asked, leaning out the window. I blinked, shaking myself out of whatever trance I'd slipped into. Do you have Choco Tacos?" The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but I had to ask. It was like some invisible force was pulling them out of me. He laughed a little nervously. "No, they stopped making those years ago." "Sorry. Got drumsticks, though." I nodded, disappointed but not surprised. Of course, there were no Choco Tacos. The universe had given me an ice cream truck from my childhood, but drawn the line at delivering the actual ice cream. Still, I ordered a drumstick and handed over a couple of crumpled bills. The man handed me the ice cream, and as our hands touched briefly, I felt a strange warmth. Not from him, exactly, but from something bigger. It was the warmth of summers past, of sticky fingers and scraped knees, of running barefoot across sun-baked asphalt to catch this exact truck before it drove away. It was the warmth of my dad calling out from the front porch to tell me to bring him something, too, but not one of those weird ones with the gumball eyes. I walked to a nearby bench and sat down. The ice cream was already melting, dripping onto the paper wrapper, but I didn't care. As I unwrapped it, the air around me seemed to shift. The cold bite of the evening softened, and for a moment, I swore I could hear the sound of bikes skidding on gravel and the laughter of kids calling out dares and challenges. I could even smell it, the mix of hot pavement and chlorine, the unmistakable scent of summer. And then it happened. As I took the first bite of my drumstick, a memory hit me so hard it was like I'd stepped into another life entirely. I was back in my childhood backyard, sitting on the rickety old swing my dad had built from scrap wood and rope. My knees were brown with dirt, and my hands were sticky with the remains of a Choco Taco. My best friend, Mia, was next to me, her face smeared with chocolate, and we were talking about absolutely nothing and everything all at once. She had this big, wild laugh that echoed off the trees, and I remember thinking, even at that age, that her laugh was the kind of thing the world needed more of. We'd made a pact that summer to never grow up, to stay exactly as we were. Two scrappy kids with no idea how good we had it. The memory faded as quickly as it came, but it left something behind, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Bittersweet, maybe, but also warm. Like a reminder from the universe that even though those moments were gone, they were still a part of me, tucked away in some quiet corner of my mind, waiting for the right song or smell or taste to bring them back. I finished the drumstick and walked home, the empty wrapper still crinkled in my hand. The ice cream truck was gone when I turned back to look, as if it had never been there at all. And maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was some strange, magical glitch in the fabric of time, or maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But that night, as I unpacked my groceries and put them away, I felt lighter somehow. Less weighed down by the endless cycle of work and errands and adult responsibilities. It's funny, isn't it? How something as small as a song or a taste or a glimpse of something familiar can pull you out of the present and drop you into a moment you thought you'd forgotten. It's like the past is always there, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to remind you of who you are and where you've been. What about you? Has anything ever caught you off guard and pulled you back to a moment you didn't even know you were missing? Let's start a new story. The day began with a penny. Not a lucky one, either. Just a dull, tarnished coin sitting on the curb, glinting weakly in the morning light. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if I hadn't been waiting for the crosswalk signal, staring down at the ground to avoid awkward eye contact with the guy beside me singing loudly to his headphones. It was heads up, though, and something about that made me pause. I picked it up without thinking and slipped it into my pocket. A few seconds later, the light changed, and the day began to change with it. I was halfway to work when I felt the penny again, pressing against my leg as I sat on the subway. I fished it out, idly rolling it between my fingers. That's when I saw it wasn't just any penny. Stamped faintly beneath Lincoln's profile was a tiny etching, a tree with looping roots and a star hanging from one of the branches. The detail was so fine I had to squint to make it out. It wasn't like any mint error I'd ever seen. A little thrill ran through me, though I couldn't explain why. I pocketed it again and forgot about it until later. Lunch came and went, as uneventful as the morning. My boss was in rare form, barking about quarterly reports, and my only solace was the fact that I had half a burrito waiting in the office fridge. When I opened the door, though, the burrito was gone. In its place was a single orange, perfectly round, perched right in the middle of the top shelf. A note was stuck to it. Trade. The handwriting was looping and strange, like it belonged to someone who had never held a pen before. I turned the orange over in my hands, wondering which of my coworkers thought this was funny, but before I could get worked up about it, I felt that penny in my pocket again. Something about its weight was different, heavier. I pulled it out, and there it was, shining like new, as though the grime had melted away. The etching was still there, clearer than before, but now the star was glowing faintly, like it was trying to tell me something. I took the orange. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of spreadsheets and emails and was willing to play along with whatever this was. When I got back to my desk, though, the note was gone, and the orange wasn't in my bag. Instead, there was a ticket, a folded scrap of stiff paper with the words Sunset Square, 6:17 p.m., written in that same strange handwriting. Sunset Square wasn't close. It was on the other side of town in a part of the city I rarely visited. I almost ignored it, but then the penny warmed in my pocket. Not hot, but enough to make me stop and stare. I figured, why not? Work was hell anyway. I left an hour early and caught a bus heading west. The square was quiet when I arrived, the sky just starting to blush with evening. It wasn't much of a square, really, just a cobblestone courtyard surrounded by old brick buildings with a fountain in the middle. The fountain wasn't running, though. Its basin was empty except for a scattering of coins glinting in the last light of the day. A man was sitting on the edge of it, flipping a gold coin between his fingers. He looked up when I approached, his face splitting into a grin. About time, he said, standing and brushing off his coat. It was too long for the weather, black and swirling around his boots like something out of a novel. Do you have it? I blinked. Have what? He tilted his head, as though surprised by the question. The penny, of course. You picked it up this morning. Heads up, wasn't it? I fished it out of my pocket, holding it up cautiously. He nodded, pleased. Good, good. The tree has roots, the roots have stars, and the stars, well, they have you. He reached out a hand, palm up. May I? I hesitated. What is this? His grin widened. It's the next step, but only if you're willing. Something in his voice made the world tilt slightly, like gravity had shifted. I looked at the penny again, then at the fountain, then back at him. And if I'm not? He shrugged. You go home, eat dinner, and tomorrow's another Tuesday. That should have been an easy choice. But I was still holding the penny, and it felt alive in my hand, humming faintly. Against all reason, I placed it in his palm. He flipped it once, then again. On the third flip, it didn't come back down. Instead, it hovered in the air between us, spinning so fast it blurred. The man stepped aside, gesturing grandly as the penny stretched into a perfect circle of light. Beyond it, I could see a different square, still cobblestones, but bathed in golden light that wasn't from any sunset I'd ever seen. The buildings were taller, spiraling impossibly upward, and the air seemed to shimmer with color. He stepped through first, vanishing with a wink. The portal wavered, waiting. I looked around the square one last time, but there was no one else to see, no one else to ask if this was insane. The penny's hum grew louder, pulling me forward. So I went. On the other side, the world sang. I don't mean metaphorically. It actually sang, each sound blending into a melody that wrapped around me like a warm breeze. The man was waiting near a tree, the same one etched on the penny, its roots glowing faintly in the ground. This, he said, spreading his arms, is where stories are born. And today, you're part of one. I still don't know exactly what happened that night, or how I made it home. The square was empty when I woke the next morning, the penny gone from my pocket, replaced by a gold coin with a tree etched into its surface. But sometimes when I stand in a quiet place at dusk, I swear I can hear the faintest song in the air. Have you ever had a moment where the world tipped sideways, and you found yourself in a story you didn't know you were part of? Let's start a new story. I came back from a funeral to find a housewarming party. It had been one of those long, dreary weeks where everything smelled like rain and regret. My uncle had passed suddenly, and as the family's lone responsible adult, I'd handled the arrangements. After 3 days of casseroles and condolences, I was desperate to return to normalcy, to the small comforts of home, a long shower, my couch, and a dumb reality show I could doze through. When I pulled into my driveway, something wasn't right. For one, the driveway wasn't mine anymore. It had been taken over by cars, a Honda Civic with peeling bumper stickers, a rusted truck, and what I could only describe as a Frankenstein van, patched together with duct tape and hope. My porch was lit up like a carnival, strings of fairy lights dangling haphazardly from the gutter. Music thudded faintly from inside, bass so loud I could feel it in my chest. I stood there, gripping my suitcase, staring at my front door as a couple of strangers stumbled out, laughing like old friends. One of them, a lanky guy wearing a t-shirt that read "Legalize Everything," gave me a cheerful nod. Hey, Monk, you made it. Made it? I hadn't even unpacked my grief, let alone invited a crowd to my home. I managed to choke out a confused "what is happening?" before a woman in a sequin jumpsuit opened the door and waved me in. Oh my God, you're here. Welcome, she exclaimed, mistaking my bewilderment for excitement. Who are you? I demanded. Who are we? She repeated, like a party host hyping the crowd. We're your new roommates. I'm Bryn. Roommates? I blinked, scanning the scene inside. The living room I'd so painstakingly furnished was unrecognizable. My coffee table buried under red Solo cups. My bookshelves repurposed for what looked like a DJ setup. There was even a makeshift karaoke stage where two guys butchered an 80s power ballad. This is my house, I said, louder now, hoping to inject some authority into my voice. Bryn tilted her head, as if I just asked her to explain quantum physics. Yeah, about that, she said, gesturing to a clipboard sitting on my kitchen counter. We signed a lease. Found the place on Rent Snatch. Super lucky. The market's brutal right now, you know? The clipboard was filled with pages of what I could only describe as forged gibberish. Some fake landlord's name, fake signatures, even a fake stamp to give it an air of legitimacy. I flipped through it, my pulse racing. "This is my house," I repeated. "I didn't rent it to anyone." Bryn shrugged, popping a Dorito in her mouth like we weren't having the most surreal conversation of my life. "That's something to take up with Todd," she said. "Who the hell is Todd?" "Your landlord." "I don't have a landlord." As if summoned by the chaos, Todd appeared, or rather, a man who I assumed was Todd, judging by the fact he was wearing sunglasses indoors and holding a clipboard of his own. He swaggered over with the air of someone who once played an extra in a crime procedural and never let it go. "Can I help you, champ?" he asked, flashing a grin that was somehow both oily and condescending. "This is my house," I snapped, hoping the sheer force of my indignation might knock some sense into him. Todd leaned in, inspecting me like I was a bug under a microscope. "Not anymore, champ," he said. "You snooze, you lose. It's in the contract." There is no contract, but there was and wasn't all at once. Todd had cobbled together just enough nonsense to convince my new roommates that this was all legitimate. And the worst part? The cops, when they inevitably showed up, sided with him. "Civil matter," they said. "Take it up with the courts." As if I could just wait out this invasion like it was a bad storm. For the next week, I lived in purgatory. Every call to the police, the courts, or anyone who might help ended with the same exhausted sighs. Meanwhile, Bryn and her merry band of misfits turned my home into something out of a reality TV show. There were theme nights, Taco Tuesday, Trivia Thursday, even a midnight silent disco where everyone danced in headphones, as if that made it better. I stayed in a dingy motel across town, watching my life unravel from a distance. When the eviction finally went through, I walked into a house that felt like a crime scene. Furniture overturned, graffiti on the walls, the unmistakable smell of spilled beer and broken trust. They'd even stolen my cat. Yes, my cat. Months later, I found myself at a party, telling the story to a group of strangers. I was bitter, sure, but I played it up for laughs, because what else could I do? Afterwards, someone came up to me, eyes wide. I heard about something like that happening. Turns out the guy running it all was part of this scam ring, moving from city to city. And just like that, I realized Todd wasn't just an annoying con artist. He was a ghost, a phantom slipping through the cracks of a broken system. And I was just another casualty in his game. Let's start a new story. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that my skin felt different. Not itchy or sore, just textured, almost velvety. I sat up and reached for my phone, but instead of the familiar rectangular weight, my hand closed around something soft and round. I looked down. In my hand was a small, perfectly ripe peach, its fuzz glinting in the morning sunlight. Confused, I set it on the nightstand and reached for my lamp. Except the lamp wasn't a lamp anymore. It was a pale green pear, its stem somehow wired into the socket, radiating a gentle, warm glow. My heart skipped. I turned to my bedside table, where my stack of books had transformed into a neat pile of golden brown toast. The whole room had become edible, or mostly edible. The curtains were cascading layers of red licorice, swaying slightly in the breeze from a small fan that now appeared to be made of delicate sugar glass. My floor was a checkerboard of chocolate tiles, and my ceiling? It shimmered with streaks of honey, thick and glistening like it had been brushed on moments before. Before I could fully process what was happening, I heard a rustle. My duvet shifted, and I watched in disbelief as it folded itself into a pile of buttery croissants, warm and flaky. I picked one up because why not? And took a bite. Perfect. Soft on the inside, just the right amount of crunch on the outside. It was, without exaggeration, the best croissant I'd ever had in my life. I should have been alarmed. Any reasonable person would be. But instead, I felt a kind of giddy curiosity. I pulled on my slippers, now marshmallow soft and scented faintly of vanilla, and padded to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was a shimmering wonderland of sugared delights. The wallpaper was a rich, swirling caramel, and the banister of the staircase was a gleaming stick of peppermint. Somewhere downstairs, I heard what sounded like a soft pop, followed by the hiss of carbonation. I followed the sound, passing a potted plant that had become an explosion of bright, glittering rock candy and a mirror framed in loops of shiny licorice. When I reached the kitchen, I found the source of the noise. The sink had turned into a fountain, bubbling over with sparkling lemonade. My fridge stood proudly in the corner, now a towering ice sculpture shaped like a pineapple. I pulled the handle, half expecting nothing to happen, but the door opened easily. Inside was a neatly organized bounty of food. Cream-filled pastries, fruits that glowed like gemstones, cheeses so fragrant and decadent they almost seemed otherworldly. "Try the grapes," said a voice behind me, soft and amused. I whipped around expecting, well, I wasn't sure what, but there was no one there, just a bowl of grapes sitting on the counter, their skin almost iridescent in the morning light. Did you just talk?" I asked. "Not exactly," came the voice again, this time from the kitchen as a whole. It wasn't a single object speaking. It was as if the entire room had a collective consciousness. "But we thought you might want a suggestion." I picked up a grape and popped it into my mouth. It was cold, sweet, and impossibly crisp, bursting with a flavor that made my knees weak. "Okay," I said, swallowing. "This is incredible. But why is it happening? Why does anything happen?" The voice replied, as if that answered everything. I decided not to question it further. Instead, I spent the morning exploring my house, which had turned into a surreal, edible landscape. My couch was a sprawling cushion of sponge cake with marshmallow pillows that whispered compliments when I sat down. The bathroom sink ran streams of strawberry milk, and my toothbrush had become a candy cane that somehow still cleaned my teeth. The towel rack was lined with sheets of soft, edible rice paper, and the toilet paper? Well, I didn't ask. In my closet, my clothes had turned into fabrics made of sponge sugar and chocolate silk. A jacket that looked like a coat of caramel wrapped itself around my shoulders with a warmth that made me feel like I was being hugged by dessert itself. Even outside, the transformation continued. My front yard was now a garden of candied flowers, their petals delicate enough to dissolve on my tongue. The mailbox had become a gingerbread house, complete with gumdrop buttons and a tiny chocolate flag waving on top. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, and the sky had taken on a faint pink hue, like the inside of a seashell. It wasn't just my house. The world had changed. My neighbor's dog trotted by, now entirely made of chocolate, but still wagging its tail like nothing had happened. Birds that looked like they'd been sculpted out of sponge sugar fluttered in the air, their wings scattering tiny sparkles that caught the sunlight. Everywhere I went, people were laughing, nibbling on pieces of their new surroundings, and marveling at the sudden, inexplicable magic. There was no fear, no panic, just a collective sense of wonder, like we'd all stumbled into a dream we didn't want to end. By evening, I was back in my marshmallow slippers, sipping hot chocolate from a mug that refilled itself every time I blinked. The sun set over a horizon that looked like a melting rainbow sherbet, and for the first time in years, I felt like nothing in the world could go wrong. So, tell me, if you could wake up in a world completely transformed, what would it look like? Let's start a new story. There's a moment every so often when I find myself staring at something utterly mundane, like the loading bar on my laptop or the unread notifications on my phone, and I realize just how weirdly intimate I've become with the minutiae of modern life. The other day, I caught myself timing my pasta to the exact second using a smart assistant. Not because I thought I couldn't manage it on my own. People have been boiling spaghetti just fine for centuries, but because it felt efficient. Like, why use my brain for something a machine can track down to the millisecond? And yet, as I stood there, waiting for the little chime to tell me the noodles were al dente, I felt vaguely ridiculous, like I was outsourcing basic humanity to a cheerful little robot voice. And it's not just cooking. I've started realizing how much of my life is dictated by silent, invisible systems that I no longer question. Like how I'll get a random email from some app saying, "Hope you're doing well. It's been 3 weeks since your last mindfulness exercise." And instead of finding this invasive, I actually feel guilty. Guilty? Over-disappointing an algorithm that exists solely to remind me to sit quietly and breathe for 10 minutes. The worst part? I'll open the app, do a half-hearted breathing exercise, and then swipe back to TikTok, where someone's teaching their pet parrot to swear. The whiplash of it all should be overwhelming, but instead, it feels kind of perfect. Like, yeah, this is exactly how life should feel right now. Equal parts structured and absurd. Speaking of absurd, I've recently developed this completely irrational fear of running out of random household items. I don't mean essentials like toothpaste or toilet paper. I mean the stupid little things like tape or batteries. Last month, I bought a 48-pack of AA batteries, not because I needed them, but because I had a fleeting thought about the remote control dying someday. Now, every time I open my junk drawer and see that enormous bulk pack staring back at me, I feel like I'm being judged by my past self. Like, you thought this was a good idea, huh? You've touched maybe 3 batteries in the last 5 years. And then there's the tape. For some reason, I own 5 rolls of it. Scotch, duct, double-sided, painters, and some weird washi tape with cats on it that I impulse bought online. I'm not sure what kind of crisis I was planning for, but I'm pretty sure that if it involves taping something together in a very aesthetically pleasing way, I'm covered. Of course, my obsession with stockpiling random objects pales in comparison to my relationship with delivery services. The other night, I was lying in bed, feeling vaguely snackish, but not enough to actually get up and cook. So, naturally, I did the modern thing. I ordered a single bag of gummy worms and a soda. When the delivery guy showed up, I tried to act casual, like I wasn't the most ridiculous human being on the planet. He handed me the bag because, yes, they actually put the gummy worms and soda in a full-size bag. And for a second, we locked eyes. There was this unspoken moment of mutual understanding. Like we both knew this was absurd, but neither of us was willing to say it out loud. I think about that moment a lot. There was something almost poetic about it. 2 strangers united in their silent agreement that yes, gummy worms at midnight are a valid life choice. But it's not all about convenience. Sometimes it's the sheer whimsy of modern life that gets me. Like the other day, I walked into my living room and saw my cat sitting on the robot vacuum as it trundled across the floor. He looked like a tiny, furry dictator surveying his kingdom, and I couldn't stop laughing. The fact that I live in a world where cat on a Roomba is a thing that just happens feels like a gift I don't fully deserve. And then there's the way technology sneaks into the smallest corners of life. My fridge, for example, has started sending me passive-aggressive notifications about its own contents. Your milk expires in 2 days. It'll announce, as if it's personally offended by my lack of attention to dairy products. Sometimes, just to spite it, I'll leave the milk in there for an extra day, like take that, you smug appliance. But then I'll inevitably cave and pour it down the sink because, let's be real, I don't actually trust myself to ignore the expiration date. What really gets me, though, is how quickly all of this has become normal. The notifications, the deliveries, the memes, the endless stream of content. It's all just life now. I'll spend an hour scrolling through videos of people restoring vintage furniture or organizing their pantries with military precision. And instead of feeling unproductive, I'll convince myself I'm being inspired. Will I ever restore a vintage chair or buy color-coded spice jars? Absolutely not. But the fantasy of it is so weirdly comforting that I can't stop. And that's the thing about all these little quirks of modern life. They're comforting in their own strange way. They might be ridiculous, even a little indulgent, but they're also kind of magical. The fact that I can share a meme with a friend halfway across the world and instantly know they're laughing on the other side of the screen, that feels like a miracle, even if the meme is just a badly drawn cartoon of a frog with the caption vibes. So, yes, sometimes I think about how much life has changed, how the silly little things have crept in and made themselves at home. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. What about you? What's one small, quirky thing about modern life that makes you smile? Let's start a new story. It happened at a gas station at 2:37 in the morning, the kind of hour where even the world seems half asleep. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd planned to drive straight through, but a blinking fuel gauge had other ideas, and now I stood under the cold fluorescence of Pump 7, fumbling for my wallet. The place was deserted except for a lone attendant inside, nodding off behind the counter, and a stray cat weaving lazily between the pumps like it owned the joint. I almost didn't notice the moth, It was fluttering around the bulb above me, a faint smudge of motion in the corner of my eye. Its flight pattern was erratic, like it couldn't decide whether to escape or stay and burn. I remember staring at it longer than I should have, my hand frozen on the nozzle. It seemed so frantic, or maybe determined. I wasn't sure, but the longer I watched, the more I found myself rooting for it, as if its tiny, flailing life depended on my silent cheerleading. And then it happened. A gust of wind came out of nowhere, and the moth was gone. Not fluttering away, not flying higher, just gone, snatched from existence like it had never been there at all. I stood there dumbly, nozzle in hand, staring at the spot where it had been, as if I could will it back by sheer force of confusion. When got it, came a voice behind me, startling me so bad I nearly dropped the gas cap. I spun around to see a man leaning against the next pump. He was wearing an old army jacket, the kind with patches that had long since faded into obscurity. His face was lined in a way that suggested he'd seen some things and didn't much care to talk about them. He gestured lazily at the lamp above me. Happens all the time. They think they're invincible, you know? Always chasing the light. I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't even sure why he was talking to me. Maybe he was bored, or maybe I just looked like someone who needed unsolicited wisdom in the middle of the night. Either way, he kept going. Funny thing is, they never learn. Generation after generation, same mistake. Straight for the glow. And for what? It's not food, it's not shelter. It's just brightness. Dumb little bugs. He shook his head, then added, almost as an afterthought, but you can't blame them. They don't know any better. I should have nodded politely and gone back to my car, but something about the way he said it stuck in my ribs. Maybe they do. I found myself saying, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Maybe it's not about the light. Maybe it's about the trying. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. The trying? Yeah, I said, warming to the thought despite myself. I mean, sure, they don't get it right. They dive into the wrong things. But isn't that kind of the point? The trying? The reaching for something, even if it doesn't make sense? He gave me a long, measured look, then snorted and lit a cigarette. Sounds like something a moth would say. I laughed, more out of nerves than anything else, but the idea stayed with me as I finished pumping gas. By the time I was back in my car, pulling onto the empty highway, I couldn't stop thinking about that moth. Not because it was special, but because it wasn't. It was just a tiny, inconsequential thing in a world full of tiny, inconsequential things. And yet, for a few fleeting moments, it had been alive. It had moved with purpose, even if that purpose was chasing something as meaningless as a light bulb. And somehow, that felt profound. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of sleepy contemplation. I thought about all the times I'd flung myself toward the wrong things. Jobs that drained me, relationships that fizzled, plans that crumbled under their own weight. None of it had gone the way I'd hoped. But wasn't the act of hoping enough? Wasn't there something beautiful, even noble, in the reaching? By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was just starting to lighten, a soft gradient of blues and grays melting into the horizon. I sat there for a long time, watching the day begin, and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not joy exactly, not regret, just a quiet understanding that maybe, in the grand scheme of things, we're all just moths chasing the glow. So, what about you? Have you ever caught yourself in a moment so small it should have meant nothing, only to find it meant everything? Let's start a new story. That's the first thing I remember thinking the morning after, as sunlight sliced through his blinds and landed squarely on my face. The room smelled like stale beer and his pine-scented cologne, and for one bewildering moment, I thought I had dreamed the whole thing. But then I turned, and there he was, Ethan, my best friend since junior high, sleeping like a dead man on his stomach, one arm thrown haphazardly across my waist. I stared at him, and then at the ceiling, my mind racing through the events of the night before. We were supposed to be celebrating. Ethan had finally landed his dream job, a fancy art director position at an agency downtown. We started at our usual dive bar, knocking back shots of tequila and eating wings until our faces were smeared with hot sauce. Then came the karaoke, me butchering an Adele ballad while he cheered me on like the idiot he was. I think I even dragged him on stage for a duet of Islands in the Stream, which neither of us knew the words to but sang anyway, laughing so hard I thought I might pass out. Afterward, when the crowd thinned and the jukebox was the only thing keeping the night alive, we stumbled back to his place. I don't even remember how it started. One second we were sitting on his couch, trading bad pickup lines like we always did, and the next his mouth was on mine. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was desperate, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. Now, lying in his bed, I felt the weight of it all pressed down on me. I nudged his arm off and sat up, trying to untangle myself from the sheets without waking him. My head pounded, not just from the tequila, but from the realization that we'd crossed a line neither of us could uncross. As I pulled on my jeans, Ethan stirred, groaning into his pillow. "Coffee," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "There's a fresh bag in the kitchen." I froze, my shirt half on. He didn't sound panicked or regretful, just normal. Like I hadn't just blown up our entire friendship. I wanted to say something witty, something that would break the tension I felt bubbling inside me, but all I managed was a weak, "Sure. Thanks." I made the coffee, pacing his tiny kitchen while the machine gurgled and hissed. What did this mean? Did it mean anything? Was it just the tequila? My thoughts were a mess, a tangled web of fear and hope and confusion. When Ethan finally shuffled into the room, shirtless and looking more awake, I handed him a mug and braced myself for the conversation I was sure was coming. Instead, he just smiled. "God, I needed this. You're a lifesaver." That was it. No awkward pause, no, about last night. He sipped his coffee and leaned against the counter, talking about some weird dream he had. It was as if nothing had happened, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself believe we could pretend it hadn't. But then a week later, it happened again. This time, there was no alcohol, no party to blame. We were watching a terrible sci-fi movie, the kind with bad special effects and dialogue that made us groan. Halfway through, he threw a piece of popcorn at me, and when I lunged to retaliate, he caught my wrist, his expression shifting. It was like the air between us changed, becoming electric. I tried to laugh it off, but then he kissed me, and I let him. The second time felt different. It wasn't impulsive or hurried. It was slow, deliberate, like we were both trying to make sense of something bigger than ourselves. Afterward, as we lay on his couch, I asked, "What are we doing?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He traced circles on the back of my hand, his brow furrowed like he was deep in thought. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't want it to stop." Neither did I, but I was terrified. Ethan was my anchor, my person, the one I called when my car broke down or when I needed someone to binge-watch bad reality shows with. If we ruined this, I didn't know if I could handle it. For weeks, we existed in this weird limbo, not quite together, but not just friends anymore. We didn't talk about labels or expectations, afraid that putting it into words would shatter whatever fragile thing we were building. It was exhilarating and maddening all at once. Then came the night everything imploded. We were at a housewarming party for a mutual friend, and I saw Ethan talking to a girl I didn't recognize. She was beautiful. Long legs, bright smile, the kind of effortless charm that made people gravitate toward her. I told myself I didn't care. Ethan wasn't mine. Not really. But the jealousy that burned in my chest told a different story. When he finally found me in the backyard, nursing a drink and staring at the string lights above, I couldn't hold it in. "So, is she your type?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Ethan blinked, confused. "Who?" "The girl you've been talking to all night," I snapped. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Are we really doing this?" I didn't answer. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said. Finally, he spoke. "Look, if this isn't what you want, just tell me. But don't act like I'm the only one who's confused here." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. I was just as scared, just as unsure. But instead of admitting it, I lashed out, trying to protect myself from the possibility of losing him. That night, we argued until our voices were hoarse. By the end, we were both exhausted, sitting on the curb outside the party. Ethan turned to me, his expression raw. "I can't be your friend anymore," he said quietly. "Not like this." It felt like the ground beneath me crumbled. But instead of falling, I reached for him. "I don't want to lose you." I whispered. You won't, he said, his voice steady. But we have to figure out what we are, because I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter. In the weeks that followed, we talked, really talked, about fears, boundaries, what we wanted. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Ethan wasn't just my best friend anymore. He was my partner, my person in a way I never saw coming. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel scared. I felt found. Let's start a new story. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what made it so startling when I found it. The morning had been unremarkable. A sleepy Sunday spent poking around the antique shop at the end of my street. I wasn't even sure why I'd gone in. The place always smelled like mothballs and forgotten lives. Rows of dusty furniture and knickknacks crowded together like an old attic someone had turned inside out. Usually, I'd spend 5 minutes pretending to browse and then leave with nothing but the faint smell of cedar clinging to my coat. But this time, as I turned a corner into one of the smaller alcoves, it caught my eye. It was a wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, tucked on a shelf behind a stack of faded postcards. Its surface was polished but worn, with tiny flowers carved into the corners. There was nothing particularly special about it, yet something about the way it sat there, quietly waiting, made me pick it up. The lid creaked as I opened it, and that's when it happened. A smell drifted out. Not strong, not overwhelming, just the faintest trace of something soft and sweet, like warm bread and sunshine. It hit me so quickly, so completely that I almost dropped the box. Suddenly, I wasn't in the antique store anymore. I was 7 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen. I could see her floral apron tied loosely around her waist, her gray hair pinned up in a way that always made her look just a little bit regal. The kitchen was filled with the golden light of a late afternoon, dust motes dancing lazily in the air. She was rolling out dough on the big wooden table, her hands strong but gentle, moving in a rhythm that seemed older than time itself. The smell of fresh-baked bread wrapped around me like a hug. It wasn't just the kitchen that came rushing back. It was everything about her house. The slightly uneven floorboards that creaked when you walked on them, the stack of old Reader's Digests on the coffee table, the clock in the living room that ticked just a little too loudly. I could feel the coolness of the linoleum under my bare feet, the rough texture of the knitted blanket she always draped over the armchair. Even the light had a feeling to it, soft and forgiving, like nothing bad could ever happen while the sun was shining. And the taste, God, the taste. She'd let me have the first slice, still steaming from the oven, slathered with butter that melted the moment it touched the bread. It was the kind of flavor that fills you up in a way food isn't supposed to anymore, like every bite carried a piece of her love, her patience, her quiet joy. Standing there in that antique shop, holding the wooden box, I felt like I could almost hear her voice, soft and steady as she hummed a tune I'd never been able to name. I could feel her hand on my shoulder, reassuring me the way only she could. It wasn't just a memory, it was like she was there alive and whole for just a moment. When I finally closed the lid, the spell broke, and I was back in the cramped little store. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the air smelled like old books and varnish again. My hands were trembling slightly. I wanted to open the box again, to see if it would work a second time, but I was afraid it wouldn't. Afraid that the magic, whatever it was, had already fled. I bought the box, of course. The cashier rang it up without a second glance, and I walked home clutching it like it might dissolve if I let it go. It sits on my shelf now, perfectly ordinary to anyone who might see it, but I know better. Every so often, when I need her, I open it again, and while the smell has faded, the memory hasn't. It rushes in, warm and vivid and whole, like the past reaching out to remind me that it's never as far away as it seems. I wonder sometimes about the person who owned the box before me. Did it hold their memories too? Did they leave some piece of themselves in it, tucked between the wooden slats? Maybe that's what it's meant to do. Carry pieces of people, little moments, so they're never really lost. It makes me think about all the tiny things we keep without realizing why. A ticket stub at the bottom of a drawer. A chipped mug you can't bring yourself to throw away. The way a certain smell, or a texture, or even the sound of rain tapping against a window can take you back so sharply it feels like you've stepped into another world. Maybe those aren't just coincidences. Maybe they're keys like that wooden box, waiting to be unlocked. So tell me, what's your key? What little thing brings you back to a moment that feels like home? Let's start a new story. Our high school was no stranger to drama, but nothing prepared us for the great raccoon siege of senior year. To this day, I'm not even sure how it escalated the way it did, but I know it started with Kyle because it always started with Kyle. Kyle was the type of guy who couldn't resist pushing limits. He once used a fog machine to haunt the school basement and set off the fire alarms. Another time, he ran a black market candy racket out of his locker until the vice principal busted him during a suspiciously loud Snickers transaction. But the raccoon incident? That was his magnum opus. It all began innocently enough during a late-night dare. Kyle claimed he could befriend the raccoons that hung around the dumpsters behind the cafeteria. To everyone's shock, he succeeded, or at least they didn't maul him. By the end of the week, he was practically a raccoon whisperer, naming them things like Trash Gordon and Lord Garbage. Kyle's newfound posse became the stuff of urban legend, and naturally, he had to up the ante. One Friday night, we were hanging out in his garage when he unveiled his plan. He was going to liberate the raccoons and let them loose inside the school. At first, we thought he was joking. Then he showed us the blueprint. An actual blueprint. It included a schedule of janitor shifts, entry points, and even a supply list, which disturbingly included bags of marshmallows labeled raccoon bait. "Dude," I said, barely containing my laughter. "This is insane." Kyle grinned, that signature devil-may-care smile. "Exactly. Who's in?" Against my better judgment, and fueled by a mix of boredom and peer pressure, I said yes. By the time we hit Sunday night, our ragtag crew of 6 was prepped for one of the most absurd heists in high school history. The plan was meticulously ridiculous. Kyle's raccoon army would enter through an unsecured side door near the gym. We'd scattered bait, marshmallows, and open jars of peanut butter throughout the halls to guide them. The idea was for chaos to unfold gradually during Monday morning classes, like a slow burn prank. What actually happened was much, much worse. The first sign of trouble was the gym teacher's scream. He was notoriously tough, a former Marine who barked orders like a drill sergeant. So hearing him yelp like a terrified child was deeply unsettling. We peered into the gym just in time to see a raccoon dangling from the basketball net while another rummaged through a duffel bag. It was absolute mayhem. Then the fire alarm went off. We hadn't anticipated this, but one of the raccoons, Kyle swore it was Trash Gordon, had managed to climb onto a shelf and knock over a lit candle during first period art class. Students flooded the hallways, only to encounter raccoons everywhere, in lockers, on desks, even raiding vending machines. Things hit a fever pitch when Lord Garbage stormed the cafeteria. Picture a raccoon perched on a lunch lady's cart, eating tater tots while she wielded a broom like a battle axe. "Ow! Out of my kitchen!" she roared as the raccoon hissed and clung to a tray of mystery meat. At this point, the principal had locked himself in his office. Over the PA system, he announced that classes were canceled and animal control was en route. Meanwhile, the student body was split into 2 factions. Those who were terrified and hiding in bathrooms, and those who saw this as the greatest entertainment of their lives. Kyle, ever the showman, stood in the middle of the quad, arms raised like a victorious gladiator. "Behold, the age of raccoons is upon us," he shouted. It would have been inspiring if not for the fact that one of his furry disciples bit him mid-speech, sending him running toward the nurse's office. Animal control eventually arrived, armed with traps and tranquilizers. The raccoons didn't go quietly. Trash Gordon held the science lab hostage for nearly an hour, scattering beakers and flipping over a model skeleton. By the end of the day, every raccoon had been captured, though not without significant property damage. The gym floor needed to be refinished, the cafeteria's tater tot supply was decimated, and the art room smelled like burnt marshmallows for weeks. As for Kyle, he somehow avoided expulsion, though he did get suspended for 2 weeks and had to take rabies shots. When asked why he orchestrated such a bizarre stunt, his only response was, "Because someone had to." He said it with such conviction that even the principal looked momentarily impressed before handing him detention papers. The Great Raccoon Siege went down as the most legendary prank in Greenview High history. For weeks, local news stations ran headlines like "Wildlife Invades Suburban School" and "Teen Masterminds Raccoon Rebellion." We even made it onto a podcast about weird high school stories. Every now and then, I drive past the school and think about that day. The raccoon-proof fencing they installed around the dumpsters is still there, a silent monument to Kyle's insanity. And while I'd never admit it out loud, I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Some legends are worth the chaos. Let's start a new story. This is the story of how I accidentally became a tour guide for a boatload of strangers. And by boatload, I mean an actual boat. It wasn't supposed to happen, okay? I was just supposed to be at the marina for like 20 minutes tops. So, it starts with me heading down there to drop off some supplies for a volunteer project, life jackets, first aid kits, that sort of thing. It's mid-July, blazing hot, and the marina's buzzing with the usual chaos. Tourists who can't tell port from starboard, kids chasing seagulls, and boat owners yelling about docking fees. Classic San Diego. I'm sweating through my shirt when this woman, let's call her Karen, because, yeah, waves me over. "Excuse me," she says in that tone people use when they assume you work there. "Our tour guide is running late, and we're supposed to leave in 5 minutes. Do you know anything about boats?" Now, technically yes. I know plenty about boats. I grew up around them, and my rescue work involves everything from kayaks to dinghies. But do I want to admit this to a group of impatient tourists? Absolutely not. So I try to brush her off with a polite, "Sorry, I'm just here to..." She cuts me off. "Oh, thank God. Can you just give us a quick orientation while we wait?" Everyone's getting restless. Before I can say no, she claps her hands and yells, "Okay, everyone, this young lady is going to get us started." And suddenly, I'm standing in front of 15 sunburned strangers, all staring at me like I hold the secrets of the ocean. I panic. Not visibly, at least I hope not, but internally I'm screaming. Then I see this little boy in the front row wearing a hat shaped like a shark, and something clicks. I lean into it. "All right, folks," I say, putting on my best confident tour guide voice. "Welcome to the San Diego Bay Eco Tour. I'm Zoe, and I'm here to make sure you have a great time while we explore the wonders of marine life." At this point, I have no idea where the actual guide is or when they're showing up. All I know is that I'm now committed to this bit. I start with the basics, pointing out the pelicans swooping over the docks and explaining how their diving technique is basically the avian version of a cannonball. Then someone asks about sea lions, so I launch into this whole thing about how they're the dogs of the sea. And if we're lucky, we might spot Shelly, a particularly lazy one who likes to nap on the floating buoys. Shelly's not real, by the way, but they don't need to know that. 5 minutes turns into 10, then 15, and the real guide is still a no-show. By now, the group's hanging on my every word. Karen's filming me on her phone, the shark hat kid is grinning like I'm a Disney character, and I'm starting to believe my own hype. I mean, why not? It's not like they're going to fact-check me mid-tour. Then, just as I'm explaining how dolphins use echolocation to hunt, a fun fact I throw in because, honestly, who doesn't love dolphins? Someone yells, "Dolphins." I think they're joking, but nope. Right there, about 100 yards from the dock, is a small pod of dolphins, casually leaping through the water, like they planned this moment just for me. The group loses their minds. Phones are out, kids are screaming, and Karen's shrieking, "You're amazing! You called the dolphins." Now, I could have corrected her. I could have said, "Oh no, that's just a coincidence." But where's the fun in that? So instead, I smile and say, "Well, you know, they're good friends of mine. Always show up for the big moments." At this point, we're all riding the high of the dolphin sighting when, out of nowhere, the actual guide shows up, running down the dock like his life depends on it. He's this flustered guy in his 40s sweating through his khakis, and he's holding a clipboard like it's the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he huffs. "There was traffic and..." Karen waves him off. "Don't worry about it. Zoe's been fantastic. She even summoned dolphins." The guide looks at me, clearly confused, and I just shrug like, what can I say? It's a gift. To his credit, he rolls with it, taking over the tour while I quietly slip away, but not before Shark Hat Kid gives me a high five and Karen insists on getting my business card. Spoiler, I don't have one. So I just write my name on a napkin and pray she doesn't actually try to hire me. As I'm walking back to my car, still buzzing from the whole thing, I hear someone shout, "Thanks, Zoe." I turn around, and there's the shark hat kid waving at me from the boat, his parents beaming like I've just given their child the greatest day of his life. And you know what? Maybe I did. So now I have this completely ridiculous story about how I accidentally became a tour guide for an hour and apparently summoned dolphins in the process. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you just had to roll with it, and it turned out way better than you expected? Because let me tell you, sometimes faking it is half the fun,